Picture a bedroom. Not your bedroom, obviously. Not any bedroom you've ever been in. Picture a bedroom the size of a tennis court, with ceilings so high the candlelight doesn't reach the top, and the shadows up there are permanent, pooled and black and unmoving, no matter how many chandeliers you light below. The walls are covered in silk panels the colour of old cream, embroidered with gold thread in patterns that took seamstresses years to complete. There are mirrors everywhere, some of them taller than two men standing on each other's shoulders, and in the candlelight they reflect and re-reflect until the room seems to go on forever in every direction. The bed is on a raised platform. It has its own canopy, its own silk curtains, its own set of railings around it like a tiny moat, designed to keep back the courtiers who crowd up to those railings at all hours of the day and night, because watching the royal family do absolutely everything — eat, pray, get dressed, get undressed, wake up, go to sleep — is not just allowed at this court, it is required. Now fill this room with people, not a polite gathering, not a dinner party that got slightly out of hand. Fill it completely. Fill it until there is no air. Fill it with men in powdered wigs and silk coats pressing their backs against the mirrors just to make room for more. Fill it with ladies in court dresses with skirts 4 feet wide, turned sideways just to fit through the door, their panniers catching on the furniture, their perfume, violet, rose, ambergris, something floral and something underneath the floral that is distinctly human and unwashed, mixing with candle smoke and cold sweat until the air in the room is a physical substance you could cut with a knife. Fill it with guards and priests and physicians and court officials and ambassadors from 6 countries. Fill it with nobles who sprinted down 6 flights of stairs and pushed through 3 antechambers and bribed a doorman just to be present in this room tonight, because being in this room tonight is the single most significant thing a courtier can do with their life. Now put a woman in that bed. She is in labour. She's been in labour for 14 hours. She is 19 years old, and every single person in this room has not just a right to be here. They have a legal obligation. Because when a Queen of France gives birth, the whole court must witness it. Every prominent noble in Versailles must be present, or at least ready to be called. Because if they are not, if the birth happens behind closed doors with only a midwife and a trusted lady-in-waiting in attendance, then someone will say, someone will always say, that the child is not real, that it was switched, that a dead baby was taken away in the night and a living one brought in through a side door in a basket, in a warming pan, in a laundry cart. The suspicion is ancient and it is vicious and it has toppled dynasties, and so the only answer, the only proof that cannot be argued with, is to make the birth itself a public event, a state occasion, a thing witnessed by dozens, by hundreds, by anyone important enough to demand entry. That is where you are tonight. That is where we are going. Not to the gilded halls as a tourist, not to gape at the Hall of Mirrors or admire the gardens from a safe distance. We're going to the birth chamber. We're going to the most private moment in a human life, made deliberately, systematically, terrifyingly public. We're going to the place where the personal body of a queen stopped being her own and became the property of a court, a kingdom, a succession. We're going to Versailles in the winter of 1778, and then we're going further, to Vienna, to London, to Madrid, to every court in Europe where the same terrible ritual played out decade after decade, century after century, because a queen's body was never just a body. It was evidence. It was proof. It was a political instrument that the state required to perform its most essential function in front of witnesses. I make these history stories I have no idea whether you're actually sleeping or whether you're wide awake in the dark, slightly horrified, asking yourself how this was ever considered normal. Either way, here we go. Your waters break at 3 in the morning on the 19th of December. You are Marie Antoinette, Queen of France and Navarre. You are 19 years old. You've been married to King Louis XVI for 8 years, and for 8 years this moment has been both the most anticipated and the most dreaded event in your life. 8 years of everyone at this court watching your belly with undisguised calculation. 8 years of physicians who are not quite physicians, who are really spies in physicians' clothing, reporting to the king's ministers on the regularity of your menstrual cycle. 8 years of your mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, writing you letters from Vienna that are warm and loving in the first paragraph, and then descend, over the next 6 pages, into increasingly frantic reminders that you have one job, one essential function, one reason you were sent from Austria at 14 to marry a French king you'd never met, and that job is this moment, this child. 8 years is a long time to wait for a moment you've been dreading. The pain is not a surprise. You knew it was coming. Every woman who has ever been near you has told you, in careful, euphemistic language, what labour feels like. The Comtesse de Noailles, your chief lady-in-waiting, the woman you privately call Madame Etiquette because she enforces court protocol with the dedication of a military general, has briefed you on the procedure of a royal birth, the way an officer briefs soldiers before a battle. Who will be present? In what order they will enter? Who stands where? Who is permitted to approach the bed and who must remain behind the gilt railing? What the royal physician will do and when? What prayers will be said and by whom? She did not tell you what the pain would feel like. No one did, really, not specifically. It starts in your lower back, deep and dull, like something is trying to unscrew your spine from the inside. Then it moves. It radiates forward and downward, and it builds, and just when you think it has reached its peak, it goes a little further, squeezing everything below your ribs into a fist. Then it stops. For a few minutes everything is fine, and then it starts again. You've been experiencing these contractions since yesterday afternoon. They were irregular at first, weak enough that you thought you might be imagining them. By evening they were real. By midnight they were serious. And now, at 3 in the morning, with the December cold pressing against the palace windows, and the fires in your rooms burning down to coals, the sensation of your waters releasing is unmistakable, and the Comtesse de Noailles, who's been sleeping in the antechamber with one ear literally pressed to the connecting door, is through that door in under 30 seconds. She takes one look at you. She's already dressed. She was always already dressed. I'll send for the king, and then she is moving with a speed you have never seen from her before, because Madame Etiquette moves slowly and deliberately as a rule, every motion calculated, every step measured, because rushing is what servants do and she is a great lady. But tonight she moves fast. Tonight everything moves fast. Because there is a baby coming, and before that baby comes, approximately every important person in Versailles needs to be in this room. The bells start ringing, not church bells, internal bells, the communication system of the palace, and the sound of those bells spreading through the corridors of Versailles at 3 in the morning brings the court awake like a wave. Doors open, candles are lit, valets scramble into livery. Ladies' maids are woken and immediately begin the complicated process of dressing their mistresses in appropriate court dress. Because you cannot attend a royal birth in your nightgown. You simply cannot. It would be unthinkable. And so all over Versailles, all over the wings and apartments and rooms that fan out from the royal apartments like the arms of an organism. People are being laced into corsets and powdered with wigs and shoved into shoes and pushed out of their doors into the freezing December corridors. By the time the king arrives, Louis, your husband, a large, gentle, somewhat awkward man who loves you as sincerely as he knows how, and whose face right now is creased with worry, he is trying very hard not to show. There are already 30 people in your rooms. By the time the royal physician, Monsieur Vermont, has examined you and confirmed that the birth is imminent, there are 60. By the time the first serious contraction rips through you in the official birth chamber, the room has been open to the full court, and it is here in this moment that the private human experience of giving birth intersects with the machine of royal protocol in a way that is, even by the standards of Versailles, extraordinary. The doors open, and they come in. You need to understand what this means. You need to understand what the room looks like and feels like and smells like as the court floods in. Because this is not a metaphor. This is not a polite gathering of concerned relatives standing respectfully at a distance. This is an event with admission requirements and an established hierarchy of proximity to the royal bed, and on a cold December night when the Queen of France is in labour, every person who has a right to be present intends to exercise that right. The doors open, and the first people through are the princes of the blood, the king's brothers and their wives, who have the right of entry to the innermost rooms. Then the grandees, the highest nobles, the ones whose family names go back far enough to have earned them this access. Then the ladies in waiting in order of rank. Then the court physicians. Then, because protocol requires it, the foreign ambassadors, because a birth in the royal family is an international event and other crowns deserve to be informed. Then everyone else who can fight their way in. The room fills, it overfills. People who could not get through the main door find the side doors. People find windows that look into antechambers with clear sight lines. Men climb on furniture. You will learn later, much later, when you are recovered enough to be told, that someone climbed up onto a fireplace mantelpiece to see over the heads of the crowd, and someone else climbed onto his shoulders, and the two of them swayed there, 6 feet off the ground, for the better part of an hour. But right now, you don't know any of that. Right now, you know the following things. You know the room is full of people. You can't see all of them because the canopy over your bed partly blocks your sight lines, but you can hear them. 150 people, maybe more, trying to be quiet and failing, their shuffling feet and rustling garments and carefully suppressed whispers creating a sound like a distant sea. You know the room is hot, impossibly sickeningly hot. The fires were stoked hours ago to keep the cold out, and now the cold is irrelevant because 150 human bodies are generating heat, the way furnaces generate heat, and the combined effect of fire and human warmth and candle flames in a room with no ventilation is something approaching the air temperature inside a baker's oven. You know the room smells. It smells like perfume, 100 different perfumes, violet and rose and civet and something musk sweet that makes you vaguely sick. And underneath the perfume it smells like bodies, because even in a palace in 1778, frequent bathing is unusual, and 150 people pressed together in a heated room will always, eventually start to smell like 150 people. And you know that another contraction is coming. You can feel it building in your back. That deep screwing in sensation moving forward and downward. You breathe. The Comtesse de Noailles is beside you, not touching you. She never touches you. She's far too formal for that, but present. Her posture rigid, her face arranged in an expression of composed concern. On your other side is your actual midwife, Madame Le Boursier, a small, practical woman with quick hands and absolutely no interest in palace politics, who is the only person in this room whose job is purely to help you. The contraction peaks. You make a sound you immediately wish you hadn't made. Not a scream. You have been coached not to scream because screaming is not dignified and dignity must be maintained even in this. But a sound, low and involuntary and carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. A ripple passes through the crowd. Not embarrassment, interest. They lean forward slightly, those 150 courtiers, in the way people lean forward at a spectacle. You close your eyes. Here is what you need to understand about why this is happening. Why this room is full of strangers while you are in labour. Why the most intimate, physical, animal thing a human body can do is being witnessed by diplomats and priests, and people you've never had a conversation with in your life. It goes back 100 years, and it goes back further than that, and it goes back to one of the most consequential rumours in the history of Europe. The year is 1688. The place is St. James's Palace in London. The King of England is James II, a Catholic, and he and his wife Mary of Modena have been trying to produce an heir for years. James has 2 Protestant daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne, and if he dies without a Catholic heir, the throne will go to one of them, and the Protestant succession will be secure, and the powerful men who prefer a Protestant England can breathe easy. But on the 10th of June, 1688, Mary of Modena gives birth to a son, a healthy, living Catholic son, and the Protestant establishment of England immediately and unanimously does not believe it. The child, they say, is not real. The real baby, James's actual child, probably another sickly infant who would not survive, was taken away in the night, and a healthy baby was smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan. A warming pan, the long-handled metal pan you fill with hot coals to warm your sheets before you get into bed. Someone opened that warming pan, the story goes, and inside it was a baby, alive and crying, passed hand to hand through the crowd of attendants until it reached the Queen's bed and was presented to the world as the heir to the English throne. It was not true, almost certainly not true. The birth had witnesses. There were people in that room. But almost certainly is not the same as certainly, and in 1688 in England, almost certainly not true was enough. Within months, James II was deposed. His son, the real son, the baby who was absolutely there and absolutely born of his mother, would spend his entire life in exile in France, known to his supporters as James III and to everyone else as the Old Pretender. The warming pan story would follow him for decades, a stain on his legitimacy that could never quite be scrubbed off, because the birth chamber had not been sufficiently public, and if the birth chamber is not public enough, there will always be whispers. This is the lesson that European courts took from 1688. Not quite the right lesson, arguably, but the lesson they took nonetheless. If you want to prevent accusations of fraud, you make the birth impossible to doubt. You make it witnessed. You make it an event attended by so many people of such high rank that no one could possibly claim ignorance or conspiracy. You turn the most private act of a woman's life into a state occasion, and you do it not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the specific kind of political logic that treats a queen's body as a document that needs to be authenticated. And at Versailles, they took this further than almost anyone else in Europe. The tradition at the French court required not just witnesses, it required specific witnesses in specific numbers in specific positions. The princes of the blood stood closest to the bed, because they were the ones with the most to gain or lose from the birth. If the baby was a girl, they kept their place in the succession. If the baby was a boy who survived, they dropped a rung. Their presence was therefore both their right and their guarantee. They were there to see, with their own eyes, that the baby was real. Behind them, the court in its entirety, and behind them, the servants, and beyond the servants, in the antechambers and corridors, anyone who had managed to get within shouting distance. The French had a particular phrase for this obligation. The Queen, they said, must give birth publicly, in public, not as a description of what happened to her, but as a prescription, a rule, a duty. She was the Queen, her body was the vessel of the succession, and the succession must be witnessed. You know all of this, lying in your bed in December 1778, with the crowd breathing around you, and the heat pressing down, and another contraction building in the base of your spine. You have known it since you were 14, and your mother first started preparing you for France. Maria Theresa did not spare you the details. She was an empress who had given birth 16 times, 16 children, the oldest of whom barely remembered a time when there wasn't a new baby, and she knew exactly what awaited you. She prepared you practically, the way she prepared for everything. You will be in pain. You will be watched. You will be required to maintain composure. These are the conditions of your position. They are not negotiable. What Maria Theresa could not prepare you for, what no one could quite prepare you for, was the smell and the heat and the specific quality of attention that fills a room when 150 aristocrats are watching something they are both fascinated by and pretending not to find fascinating. Another contraction. This one is worse than the last. They have been getting worse in a predictable, relentless progression that Madame Le Boursier monitors with calm professional interest, the way a clockmaker monitors the mechanism of a watch. She speaks quietly to you in between contractions. Her voice is low and practical. She does not use the language of the court. She says things like, "Push when I tell you," and try to breathe slowly, and that one's done. The next one won't be as bad. She is the only person in this room speaking directly to your body rather than to your position. The king is at your bedside. He has sent away the screens that would normally shield the bed from the room. The screens are supposed to be there. They are part of the protocol, but they have been accidentally pushed aside in the rush of people, and no one has thought to put them back, and Louis either hasn't noticed or doesn't want to draw attention to it by ordering it corrected now. He holds your hand. His hands are large and somewhat clumsy and completely genuine, and you grip them during contractions with a force that would alarm you if you were thinking about anything other than what is happening to your body. You're not thinking about anything other than what is happening to your body. It occurs to you dimly in between contractions, the first time in 8 years at Versailles that your mind has been entirely somewhere else. Versailles requires constant performance, constant awareness of how you appear, what you are saying, who is watching. Your face is a diplomatic instrument. Your clothing choices are political statements. Even the way you nod at a person or fail to nod contains information that will be analysed and gossiped about before you have crossed the room. You have been performing since you were 14 years old, performing so continuously that the performance and the self have become nearly indistinguishable. But now the performance is simply impossible. Now the pain is too large and too specific and too present for any other thought to survive alongside it. The contraction rises and you breathe and grip and push when Madame Le Boursier tells you to push. and the room exists somewhere outside all of this, a buzzing peripheral thing, a sound like the sea, a warmth like a fire too close. And then something shifts, not the pain doesn't shift, but something underneath the pain, something structural, moves, and Madame Le Boursiers' voice changes register, still calm, still professional, but with a new sharpness in it. And the royal physician moves closer, and the king's hand tightens on yours, and somewhere behind you and above you in the crowd, despite all the elaborate etiquette and all the coaching about appropriate behaviour, someone makes a sound that is almost involuntary, almost reverent, because the baby is coming now, really coming. The theory and the dread and the endless waiting have contracted down to this moment, this specific physical fact, this transition from being a queen with a great deal riding on this birth to being a person who is quite genuinely doing something her body might not survive. Because childbirth in 1778 at Versailles, for all its gold and silk and court physicians, is still childbirth, which means it is still one of the most dangerous things a human being can do. The official mortality statistics for women in labour in 18th century France are not statistics anyone looks at comfortably. Roughly 1 in 100 deliveries ends in the mother's death. That's the estimate for attended births, for women who had access to midwives and physicians. For unattended births, it's much worse. For complicated births, it's worse still. And even the best attended birth can go wrong in ways that no physician in 1778 has the tools to correct. You know this. Of course you know this. Every woman in that room knows this. The ladies in waiting who are pressed against the gilt railing watching you. Some of them have given birth themselves, have their own memories of this particular terror, and whatever complicated feelings they have about the spectacle they are required to attend, none of them is entirely without sympathy, because they know what this is. The final contractions come close together, faster and stronger, and you stop trying to maintain composure entirely and simply push when Madame Le Boursier tells you to push, and breathe when she tells you to breathe, and grip the king's hand until you feel his knuckles shift slightly under the pressure. And somewhere behind all of this there is a vague awareness of the room, of the crowd, of the elaborate machinery of witness and protocol that fills every corner of this enormous overheated space. And then a sound that is not yours, a thin, reedy, outraged cry, the sound of a new person encountering cold air for the first time and objecting to it strenuously. And Madame Le Boursier says something in a low voice that you can't quite hear, and the royal physician leans forward, and Louis makes a sound that is not quite a word, and you feel the strange hollow lightness that follows the removal of something that has been inside you for 9 months. Madame Le Boursier holds up the child. The room goes absolutely still. And then the premier gentilhomme de la chambre, the first gentleman of the bedchamber, whose specific job tonight is to make this announcement, straightens up to his full height, and his voice carries to every corner of the room and into the antechambers beyond. Le roi a un fils. The king has a son. The room erupts, not politely, not with the measured applause of courtiers maintaining decorum, with a roar. 150 people releasing 8 years of held breath, 8 years of political anxiety, 8 years of watching the Queen's waistline for signs of hope, and now there is a sign that is unmistakable and squalling, and already turning red in the face with the effort of existing. And you, Marie Antoinette, 19 years old, who have just done something your body will take months to recover from, who are still on your back in a birthbed with a room full of people staring at you. You go grey. Not from the news, not from joy or relief or emotion of any kind. You go grey because the room is too hot and the air is too thin and there are too many people, and the combination of blood loss and exertion and the dense oxygen-depleted atmosphere of a room in which 150 people have been breathing for over an hour is, quite simply, making it impossible to breathe. The king sees it. He does not hesitate, which surprises people later when they talk about it, because Louis is not always quick to act. He shouts, actually shouts, for the windows. The windows are sealed for winter. They are shuttered and latched, and no one at Versailles opens windows in December because cold air is considered dangerous to health, particularly to a new mother, particularly to a newborn. But Louis shouts for the windows, and someone breaks the latches, and the cold December air comes flooding in, and you breathe it in great shaken gulps, and the grey at the edges of your vision recedes. Later, days later, weeks later, this moment will be added to the legend of your birth chamber. The queen who nearly suffocated while giving the king an heir. The windows that had to be broken open. The crowd so large, so insistent, so absolutely convinced of their right to be present that they had consumed all the air in the room. You will give birth again. 3 more times, in fact. A second daughter in 1781, a second son in 1785, a third daughter in 1786. And because of what happened in December 1778, the protocol will be modified, not eliminated. The witnesses will still come, the room will still fill, but the number of people admitted will be reduced. Not dramatically, but reduced. It will never be enough. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in the exhausted animal immediacy of the minutes after birth, there is the child, a boy, Louis-Joseph Xavier François, Dauphin of France, screaming in Madame Le Boursiers' practised hands. He will be wrapped and taken, not by you, not immediately, the protocol is clear on this, to a different room, where the royal wet nurse is waiting, because queens of France do not nurse their own children. That is not what queens of France are for. Queens of France provide children. Other women feed them. The room begins slowly to empty. The courtiers file out in the same order they filed in, the highest ranking first. They have seen what they came to see. The birth has been witnessed. The succession is established. The child is real. And you lie in the cooling room, cooling now that the windows are open, now that the crowd is gone, and feel the specific exhaustion of someone who has just done something enormous in front of an audience. This is Versailles. This has always been Versailles. But this was not always what Versailles looked like. The tradition did not begin here, and it did not begin in this particular form. And to understand why a room full of courtiers watching a queen give birth seemed not just acceptable but essential, you need to go back further. Back before Louis XVI. Back before the Sun King himself. Back to the logic that made this seem, to the people who constructed the system, not cruel but necessary. The fear of the fraudulent birth is older than France. It runs through Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis contains provisions about the legal status of children born to royal or noble mothers, about the witnesses required to establish paternity and legitimacy. It runs through medieval canon law and medieval civil law, and through the specific anxieties of every dynasty that understood, with perfect clarity, that the body of a queen was the mechanism by which kingdoms passed from generation to generation, and that mechanism had to be verifiable. In England, the tradition was somewhat different in practice, but identical in purpose. When a queen was in labour, the members of the Privy Council were required to be nearby, available to witness the birth, or at least to be summoned immediately after. For some births, they were in the room, for others, in the antechamber. The important thing was proximity and record. Someone of sufficient rank and credibility had to be able to swear afterward that they had seen the child emerge. The problem with proximity and record, of course, is that it is only as reliable as the people doing the witnessing. And people can lie. People can be bribed. People can be mistaken in good faith, or simply absent from the crucial moment. And so over time, the tendency was always to add more witnesses, more officials, more layers of verification, until the birth chamber was not a birth chamber at all, but a court in miniature. Go back to France, in the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, Marie Antoinette's great-great-grandfather-in-law. Louis XIV understood better than almost anyone in history that power is performance. He built Versailles not as a home, not as a pleasant place to live, because Versailles, particularly in its early years before the plumbing was sorted out, and the smells became only periodically overwhelming rather than continuously oppressive, but as a stage. Everything at Versailles was theatre. The lever, the morning ritual at which the king got out of bed and dressed in front of an audience of nobles who considered it an honour to hand him his shirt. The couvert, the formal dinner at which the king ate in public while his court stood and watched him chew. The promenade, the card games, the chapel attendance, all of it performed, all of it witnessed, all of it coded with the language of power and hierarchy, and the absolute insistence that the king's body was not a private thing. If the king's body was public property, the queen's body was doubly so, because the queen's body was where the next king came from. Louis XIV's queen, Marie-Thérèse of Austria, gave birth 6 times. 4 of her children died young, as so many royal children did. The infant mortality rate was savage even in palaces, perhaps especially in palaces, where the well-meaning interventions of court physicians sometimes kill the children they were trying to save. But the births themselves were public, fully public, the rooms filled with courtiers and officials and anyone with a claim on presence. And the queen before her, Anne of Austria, Louis XIV's mother, the queen who gave France Louis XIV himself, her pregnancy was one of the most politically significant in French history, because she had been married to Louis XIII for 22 years without producing an heir. 22 years of miscarriages and stillbirths, and rumours that the king would divorce her and that the throne would go to his brother's line. 22 years of anxiety, and then in 1638, a child, a healthy, living, surviving child, the future Louis XIV. The birth was attended by precisely the people it needed to be attended by. The evidence was established, the succession was secured, and the entire court of France breathed out. But imagine what it was like to be Anne of Austria in that room, to be a woman who had been waiting 22 years for this moment, carrying 22 years of failure and grief and the constant grinding awareness that her failure to produce an heir was a political catastrophe. And now here, finally, the moment, and the room full of people, the room full of faces watching, the room full of the same court that has been watching her, judging her, calculating her political value for over 2 decades, now crowding in to witness the one thing that can redeem all of that. The personal and the political collapsed into a single unbearable moment. This is what it meant to be a queen. You were not, in any meaningful sense, a person. You were a position, You were a function. You were the vessel through which the dynasty continued, and your body's most intimate workings were state property, documented and witnessed and recorded in court registers with the same careful attention given to the signing of treaties or the ratification of laws. Let's go to Vienna. Let's go to the Habsburg court, because if Versailles had made a theatre of the birth chamber, the Habsburgs had made it an institution. The Habsburgs were, by the mid-18th century, the oldest surviving royal dynasty in Europe. They had been intermarrying with each other and with every other royal house on the continent for centuries, so aggressively intermarrying in fact that the genetic consequences were becoming visible in the famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that appeared with increasing frequency in portraits of the family and with increasing severity in actual family members. The Habsburgs needed new blood. They also needed heirs. They always needed heirs. Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, was the greatest exception to the Habsburg norm in the 18th century. She was the empress, the ruler in her own right. The woman who fought the War of Austrian Succession at 23 with a baby on her hip. Literally, she held the infant Crown Prince Joseph during her speech to the Hungarian Diet. And it is one of the most calculated pieces of political theatre in the history of a dynasty that was excellent at political theatre. She had 16 children, 16 pregnancies, carried to term in the course of an empire, a war, the management of a multinational state that included Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the Spanish Netherlands, and various Italian territories. 16 births, all of them witnessed, all of them official events, all of them surrounded by the elaborate machinery of Habsburg court protocol, which was, if anything, more rigidly formal than Versailles. The Spanish influence on the Habsburg court was centuries old, and the Spanish court had developed a ceremonial language so intricate and so demanding that etiquette manuals ran to hundreds of pages, and court officials spent years studying them. Maria Theresa bore it all with the practical stoicism of a woman who understood that this was the price of her position. She did not, so far as we know, complain about the public births. She had too much to do, too many empires to run, too many children to produce and then educate and then marry off strategically to royal houses across Europe, including, inevitably, France. Marie Antoinette was her 16th child, the last, born when Maria Theresa was 42 years old, which in 1755 was not young for a mother, and especially not young for a woman who had already been pregnant 15 times. The birth of Marie Antoinette was witnessed, as all the others had been, by the appropriate officials and nobles of the Habsburg court. It was recorded, it was verified, and then the baby was handed to a wet nurse and Maria Theresa went back to governing, because empires do not wait for maternal recovery. This was the world into which Marie Antoinette was born, a world in which the births of queens were public events by definition and design. She grew up understanding this. She absorbed it the way children absorb the rules of the house they grow up in, not as exceptional or strange, but as simply how things are. When she was prepared for her marriage to France, the public birth was among the many duties explained to her. When she arrived at Versailles at 14, she entered a court that had been practicing this ritual for generations. What she could not know in 1778, lying in that overheated room with the windows finely open and the December air cold on her face, was that she was living through the last of its kind, that the tradition that seemed immovable, that seemed as permanent as the palace itself, would end within her lifetime, that the revolution was coming and it would sweep away not just the monarchy, but the elaborate ceremonial world that justified and sustained it, including the ritual of the public birth. But we are not there yet. Let me tell you about Maria Leszczyńska. You don't know this name as well as you know Marie Antoinette's, and that is a shame, because Maria Leszczyńska was one of the most patient women in the history of the European royalty, which is saying something, because patience was essentially the only tool available to queens who wanted to survive their marriages. Maria was a Polish princess, the daughter of Stanisław Leszczyński, King of Poland, which sounds impressive until you realise that Stanisław had been deposed twice by the time Maria was born, and was living in exile in France when the marriage negotiations began. She was 22 years old and considered almost certainly unmarriageable, being a Protestant by background, a princess without a kingdom, and not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the French court, which had very specific and demanding standards. But Louis XV was 15 and needed a queen, and his council of advisers had gone through the available options with the systematic thoroughness of people trying to solve an extremely complicated puzzle. And Maria Leszczyńska was, on balance, the best available candidate. She was healthy. She was of appropriate blood. She was importantly considered docile and unlikely to cause political trouble. She was Catholic. She was willing. She arrived in France in 1725 and began producing children almost immediately. Over the course of the next 24 years, she would give birth 10 times, 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy, 10 pregnancies, 10 public births. 10 times in 24 years she lay in a bed in front of a room full of courtiers and performed the essential function for which she had been selected. She never complained. Or rather, she did not complain in ways that were recorded, which amounts to the same thing historically. She was, by all accounts, a private woman, pious, somewhat reserved, uncomfortable with the social whirl of Versailles and the elaborate games of the court. She liked music and painting and her children. She liked the company of people she trusted, not the company of people she was required to perform for. And yet, she performed 10 times. The births became routine in the way that any repeated event becomes routine, no matter how strange it would seem to an outside observer. After the 4th or 5th time, the court knew the procedure, the bells, the flood of courtiers, the filling of the room, the witness, the announcement. It was an event that Versailles had absorbed into its rhythm. The 10th birth, in 1737, was different only in that everyone knew it would be the last. Louis XV had already begun his long series of affairs. The Marquise de Pompadour was still years in the future, but the pattern was established, and the Queen had essentially withdrawn from the role of royal companion, which she had never been particularly suited for, and settled into the role of royal mother, which she was excellent at. After 1737, she remained at Versailles, she raised her children, she attended chapel twice a day, and she did not give birth again. 10 public births, not a protest lodged, not a complaint recorded. History tends to see this as passivity, as resignation. I am not sure that's right. I think it might be something harder than passivity, something closer to a specific kind of dignity that involves bearing what cannot be changed without letting it define you. You do the thing that is required. You endure the room full of people. You give birth in front of the court of France, and then you receive your child if you are permitted to, and then you sleep, and tomorrow you do the next thing. This is the life. Let's go back to England. Let's go back to the warming pan. Because the warming pan story, which I mentioned earlier, is worth lingering on. because it is one of the great examples of how rumour and political motivation can make an impossible thing feel plausible. James II's wife, Mary of Modena, had been pregnant several times before 1688. The pregnancies had not gone well. Miscarriages, stillbirths, children who died in infancy. This history made the court anxious. It also made some of the Protestant establishment of England almost actively hopeful that the pattern would continue, because a Catholic heir was not in their interest. When Mary became pregnant again in late 1687, the anxiety was palpable. Princess Anne, James's Protestant daughter, the future Queen Anne, wrote letters to her sister Mary in the Netherlands that read, in retrospect, as the letters of someone who was already constructing an exit narrative. She wrote that she had serious doubts about the Queen's pregnancy, that there was something suspicious about it. She was preparing herself and her correspondence for the possibility that the birth would happen and the child would be announced and she would not accept it. The birth happened on June 10th, 1688. Mary of Modena was in labour at St. James's Palace. The room, as was custom, had witnesses. There were people present. Not as many as there perhaps should have been. Some accounts suggest that the normal complement of witnesses had not fully assembled before the birth occurred, which was faster than expected, but there were people. The Lord Chancellor was there, several ladies of the bedchamber. The Archbishop of Canterbury was in the antechamber. The child was born, alive, a boy, and immediately the whispers started. Anne was not present at the birth. She had gone to Bath conveniently. She wrote to her sister that she had not been allowed to be present, though the evidence suggests she simply left before the birth. She wrote that the warming pan story was credible, that she had reason to doubt. The warming pan story was, if you think about it for 30 seconds, physically absurd. A warming pan is designed to hold coals and slip between bed sheets. It is metal. It is hot. You cannot put a living baby in a warming pan and carry it through a room full of people without the baby dying, or screaming, or both. The laws of physics and infant biology make the warming pan conspiracy essentially impossible. But people believed it anyway. Or rather, people believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because belief is not always governed by physics or infant biology, and because in 1688 the political stakes made the impossible story much more attractive than the boring, complicated truth. 6 months after the birth, James II was gone, the glorious revolution. William of Orange arrived. James fled to France. The baby, the real baby, the definitely real baby, went into exile with his father. And for the next 2 generations, the question of James Francis Edward Stuart's legitimacy followed him everywhere he went. He grew up in the French court under the patronage of Louis XIV, who recognised him as the legitimate King of England, Scotland and Ireland. He made several attempts to reclaim his throne. None of them succeeded. He died in Rome in 1766 at the age of 77, never having set foot in England again. The warming pan story still attached to his name like a shadow that never quite faded. This is what a bad birth, or rather a poorly witnessed birth, a birth with insufficient courtiers in the room could do to a life, to a dynasty. This is why the rooms filled. But there is another side to this. There is the question of what it did to the women, not the political consequences. We've talked about those, the personal consequences, the physical consequences, the specific horror of giving birth in front of an audience. Go back to that room in Versailles. Go back to December 1778. Go back to that specific combination of heat and smell, and the sound of 150 people breathing. Now consider that some of those people are trying to see, not in a vague, general sense, specifically trying to see. Because the whole point of being in the room is witnessing, and witnessing requires visibility. And so there are people in that room who are craning their necks and standing on tiptoe and nudging their neighbours aside to get a better angle on the royal bed. There are people who've been awake for hours, who drag themselves out of bed at 3 a.m. in December and dressed formally and fought their way through palace corridors, and they're not going to stand in the back and see nothing. This was understood. It was not secret. It was simply the reality of the ritual. The accounts left by courtiers who attended royal births describe, with remarkable frankness, the scramble for position, the jostling, the deliberate use of physical mass to establish proximity to the royal bed. Tall men had advantages. People who arrived first had advantages. People with high rank could simply walk to the front and expect the lower rank to step aside. No one describes what this looked like from the bed. That perspective was not recorded. The Queen was not asked afterward to describe her experience. She was the subject of the event, not its narrator. But we can infer from Marie Antoinette's near suffocation that the air quality in the room was genuinely dangerous. We can infer from the accounts of court physicians that the heat regularly caused women to faint, not the labouring Queen necessarily, but the ladies in waiting pressed together in the back, corseted and wigged and trapped in a closed space. We can infer from the modifications made after 1778, the reduction in numbers, the better management of the windows, that even people who thought the public birth was entirely appropriate recognised that its execution was often physically harmful. And we can infer from the diaries and letters of queens who left any record at all that the experience of giving birth in public was not one that any of them found acceptable. It was endured, it was survived, it was not welcomed. Marie Antoinette's correspondence with her mother in the months before the 1778 birth is partly missing. She famously destroyed many of her letters for reasons that may or may not have had to do with the events of the Revolution. But what survives suggests a woman trying to mentally prepare herself for something she could not control. She writes about the weather at Versailles. She writes about the court gossip. She writes about her friendship with the Princesse de Lamballe and her love of fashion and the peculiarities of Louis XVI's character. She does not write about the birth. There is something very loud about that silence. Her second birth was easier to manage, if not easier to endure. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse had been born in December 1778, and the modifications to the protocol meant that the room was somewhat less crowded, still full by any reasonable standard. Dozens of courtiers, all the princes of the blood, the necessary officials, but not the unbearable crush of the first birth. Her son, Louis Joseph, born in 1781, was another ordeal of a different kind. He was born as the Dauphin, the direct heir, which meant the political stakes were even higher, and the required witnesses were, if anything, more numerous than before. The birth was announced throughout Versailles with the ringing of bells and the firing of guns, and the city of Paris celebrated with the genuine enthusiasm that it still had for the French royal family in 1781, before everything began to curdle. Louis Joseph was a small, delicate boy who almost immediately began to show signs of the tuberculosis of the spine that would kill him at the age of 7. He never knew what a normal childhood felt like, this child whose birth had been witnessed by the entire French court. He was born in a crowd, and he lived his short life in the goldfish bowl of royal scrutiny, and he died in 1789, the year his parents' world began to fall apart in earnest, the year the Revolution came. Let me tell you about the last one, the last public royal birth at Versailles. It was July 1786. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, 30 years old now, not the terrified 19-year-old of December 1778, but a woman who had been queen for 12 years and knew every corner of Versailles' ceremonial machinery, was in labour with her fourth child. A girl, as it would turn out, Sophie Hélène Béatrice, who would live only 11 months and die of convulsions, the second of Marie Antoinette's children to predecease her. But in July 1786 she was not yet born, and the court assembled as it always assembled, and the room filled as it always filled, and the birth proceeded according to the established protocol. Except that this time something was different in the room, not in the ritual. The ritual was unchanged, but in the atmosphere, in the quality of attention. The French public's love affair with Marie Antoinette had been souring for years by 1786. The diamond necklace affair, a scandal involving a fraudulent purchase of an enormously expensive jewel necklace in the Queen's name, carried out by a confidence trickster whose schemes the Queen was entirely innocent of, but with whom she could be made, in the public imagination, to seem complicit, had broken earlier that year. The pamphlets were circulating, the rumours were circulating, the jokes, increasingly cruel, were circulating in Paris and in the provinces, and being repeated in hushed voices even at Versailles. Madame Deficit, they called her, because of the extravagance, real and imagined. And the people in that birth chamber in July 1786, the courtiers, the officials, the witnesses, were not the same people who had filled the room in December 1778, or rather some of them were the same people, but their feelings about the Queen had changed. The warmth was less, the relief was more guarded, the roar of celebration when the child was announced was genuine but shorter-lived. The child lived 11 months. The Queen would have one more pregnancy in 1787, which ended in a miscarriage. And then the world changed. The revolution began not as a single event, but as an accumulation of crises. The debt, the harvests, the price of bread, the long-simmering rage of a population that had watched the royal court perform its rituals of extravagance for decades, while ordinary people could not afford to eat. It began with pamphlets, and then with the convening of the Estates General, and then with the storming of the Bastille in July 1789, which is the date everyone learns in school, the date that seems to have happened suddenly even though it had been building for years. Marie Antoinette did not have a fifth child. She would give birth no more. The world she had been born into, the world of Versailles and its elaborate ceremonial life, and its public births, and its gilt railings around royal beds, that world was ending. The royal family would leave Versailles in October 1789, escorted back to Paris by a mob. They would live in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, under a kind of supervised freedom that was not really freedom at all. The king would attempt to flee in 1791 and be caught at Varennes and brought back in humiliation. He would be tried and executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette would be tried and executed in October 1793. She was 37 years old. She had given birth 4 times, publicly, in front of the assembled court of France. She had survived all of them. She had given France a dauphin who died at 7. She had a daughter, Marie-Thérèse, who survived everything, who would outlive her parents and her brother and live to 80, the last of Louis XVI's children, and a second daughter who lived 11 months. That is the legacy of the public birth. Not triumph, not the secured succession that all those witnesses were there to guarantee. The succession failed anyway. The dynasty ended anyway. The elaborate ritual of witnessing, the rooms full of courtiers, the bells and the prayers and the scramble for position near the royal bed, none of it saved anything. But that is the thing about ritual. It rarely does what it claims to do. It does something else. It creates a shared experience, a shared language, a structure that holds people together even when the practical purpose has long since become irrelevant. The public birth was theatre. Finally, like so much else at Versailles, was theatre. A performance of certainty and continuity in a world that had neither. The witnesses left. The doors closed behind them, and somewhere in the ruined room, amid the overturned chairs and the guttered candles and the smell of too many people in too small a space, there was a woman in a bed, and occasionally a child. The ritual served the state. The woman endured. Let me take you somewhere else now. Let me take you to England, but not to the warming pan and not to 1688. Let me take you to 1688's aftermath, to the long shadow it cast, to what England did differently and what it did the same. The English tradition of witnessing royal births was, in some ways, less theatrical than the French version, but no less rigorous in its essentials. When a Queen of England was in labour, the senior members of the Privy Council were required to be available, and in the most significant births, they were required to be present. Not necessarily in the room. The English were somewhat more willing to accept an antechamber as adequate, but close enough to attest that the birth had occurred naturally and the child was genuine. After 1688, after the warming pan, the requirements hardened. They did not become as theatrical as Versailles. England was not Versailles, and the English court, though elaborate, had never quite achieved the same level of performative excess. But they became more stringent, more demanding, more insistent on the presence of specific people in specific places. Queen Anne, who'd written those letters doubting her stepbrother's legitimacy, found herself in 1700 in the position of being the last of her line. 17 pregnancies, 17 children, none of them surviving childhood. The last one died in 1700, a boy of 11. It is one of the most devastating records in royal history. 17 attempts at succession, all of them failures. And Anne herself would die in 1714, ending the Stuart line. But in the years when Anne was still pregnant, still hoping, still enduring the succession of births and the succession of losses, the births were attended, they were witnessed, they were documented with the careful hand of a court that knew, by now, exactly how much depended on the credibility of the record. And what did it feel like for Anne, who had not only to endure the public birth, but to endure it knowing that the child had a good chance, a historically very good chance of dying, who had to perform the drama of the birth chamber and then wait for the child to survive the first week, the first month, the first year. We do not know what it felt like for Anne. She was not a woman who left extensive personal records. What we have are the political documents, the formal correspondence, the public record. The private person, the woman who had 17 pregnancies and 17 losses, and who sat on a throne that she had inherited partly through her own role in denying her brother's legitimacy, that person is largely hidden from us. What we know is that she continued. She went through it. She performed the role and endured the outcomes and kept doing both, because there was no other option, because Queens of England in the early 18th century did not have the option of not performing their biological function publicly. Let me tell you about another queen. Let me tell you about one who pushed back. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Queen of England as the wife of George III, gave birth 15 times between 1762 and 1783. She and her husband were, by the standards of royal marriages, genuinely fond of each other. George III was famously faithful in a way that his predecessors and successors were largely not, and Charlotte ran her household with an efficiency and practicality that contrasted sharply with the studied extravagance of Versailles. Charlotte's births were attended, but the English court by the 1760s was beginning to modify its approach. The full theatrical presentation of a Versailles-style birth was not the English way. The witnesses were present, the required officials were there, but the room was not filled to suffocation with every nobleman who could fight his way in. There was an attempt, in the English version of this tradition, to balance the requirements of witness against something that might have been described, if anyone at the time had thought to describe it, as basic human dignity. It was not entirely successful, but the attempt was made. Charlotte, by all accounts, bore her 15 pregnancies with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. She and George had their political difficulties. She was involved to a degree in the management of his periods of mental illness, which were real and devastating. But the personal relationship was strong. She was not, as far as we can tell, a woman who dwelt on the injustices of her position. She was a woman who got on with it. 15 children, the last one born when she was 38. All of them witnessed, all of them documented. The English tradition would persist through the Victorian era, though in modified form. Victoria herself gave birth 9 times, and the public element of the births shifted. They were more private than the Versailles model, but the principle of witness was maintained, with politicians and officials waiting in adjacent rooms, ready to be summoned, ready to attest. Victoria, who would have had strong feelings about everything, had very strong feelings about this. She found pregnancy undignified. She found childbirth terrifying. She found the requirement of political witnesses intrusive. She said so to her diary, to her letters, to the people around her who were unfortunate enough to be in the path of her opinions. But she did it anyway, 9 times. The last formal requirement for government ministers to be present at royal births in Britain was abolished in 1948, by which time it had become, by general agreement, an embarrassing anachronism that served no practical purpose. The warming pan had been debunked by history and physics and common sense. The idea that a fraudulent child could be smuggled into a royal bed without anyone noticing had become not just unlikely but faintly absurd. And so the ministers were no longer required to stand outside the birth room. And so the thing ended, quietly in a press release in 1948, not with a revolution but with a parliamentary decision. 300 years of ritual, accumulated tradition, women in beds in front of witnesses, ended with a note in the London Gazette. The long shadow of 1688 finally lifted. But you're not in 1948. You're in the room in Versailles in December 1778. You're in the sweat and the heat and the pain and the overwhelming reality of the body doing what bodies do, regardless of who is watching, and the crowd is still there, around you, still breathing, still craning, still witnessing. Let me tell you about the specific texture of that night, not the political history, not the long context, the specific, physical, immediate night. The fire in the room has been burning for hours. It was stoked when Labour began, because cold air was believed to be dangerous, and the fires at Versailles in winter were enormous by necessity. The palace was badly insulated. The December winds came through the old stones, and keeping rooms warm required a constant supply of wood that was itself a significant logistical operation. So the fire has been burning, and the room is full of people, and the candles add their heat to everything else, and the temperature in the room is something between uncomfortable and dangerous. You are sweating. This is not permitted to be mentioned in the formal accounts. Queens of France do not sweat. They perspire at most, minimally, beautifully, but you are sweating. Lying in a bed on a raised platform in a room that is 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the December night outside those sealed windows, doing the most physically demanding thing your body has ever done, surrounded by 150 people, who are also sweating and who are also too dignified to acknowledge it. The smell. The smell is the thing that no account adequately prepares you for. And you know this because you have heard accounts from women who attended other births, women who tried to describe it to you in the careful language of the court, and all of their descriptions fell short of the reality. The smell of the birth itself, which is blood and effort and the specific animal intimacy of the body's interior made suddenly exterior, the smell of the crowd, perfume, yes, 100 varieties, but also the smell of bodies in formal dress that they have been wearing since 3 a.m, bodies that are too hot, bodies that are performing the considerable physical labour of standing perfectly still for hours in a room with no ventilation. And underneath all of that, the smell of the candles, animal tallow for the servants' candles, beeswax for the official ones, burning and smoking and adding their particular note to the already thick air. You breathe this air. You breathe it in great heaving gasps during the contractions, when your body is demanding oxygen and everything else becomes irrelevant. The air tastes of all the smells combined, and it is warm, and it is not quite enough. And you know in some animal way that the air in this room is not quite enough. Your hands grip the rails of the bed. The rails are gilt. Everything is gilt at Versailles, and they are slightly warm from the heat of the room, and they are smooth under your hands except for the raised scrollwork at the ends, and you grip them during contractions, because gripping something, having your hands closed around something solid and real, makes the pain minutely more manageable. Minutely. Not much, but a little. Madame Le Boursiers' hands are on you. She is checking progress, the way midwives check progress, with the practical disregard for propriety that is her professional right and her essential tool. The physicians, there are 3 of them in the room tonight, because a dauphin cannot be delivered without redundancy, without multiple qualified men who can attest to having been present. Hover at the appropriate distance, deferring to the midwife's expertise while preparing to intervene if expertise is not enough. The king's face is close to yours. He has been here since before the court arrived, before the protocol took over, before the room filled. He was the first person called when your waters broke, and he came at a run. The accounts say this, that Louis ran through the corridors of Versailles in his night clothes to get to your room, which is simultaneously touching and somehow very on brand for a king who was always more human than regal. And he has been here since, holding your hand, his face a landscape of barely managed anxiety. He says very little. He's not a verbal man, Louis. He thinks before he speaks, and he speaks rarely, and when he does it is usually practical, concrete, actionable. But right now there is nothing practical or concrete or actionable to say, so he is silent. He is simply present. His hand is in yours. That will have to be enough. The final contractions, when they come, erase everything. The room, the crowd, the smell, the heat. All of it recedes behind a wave of physical sensation so specific and so overwhelming that there is nothing else. Your world contracts to the size of your own body, to the specific animal, absolute work that your body is doing right now. Push, breathe, hold, push. Madame Le Boursiers' voice steady and low and absolutely in charge. Push. And then, the sound that is not yours, high and thin and immediately furious, the sound of a new person objecting to the cold, to the air, to the sudden and apparently unreasonable demand that they exist independently and breathe on their own. Your son. The Premier Gentilhomme's voice filling the room. Le roi a un fils. And the room erupts, and the air gets thinner, and the windows are broken open, and the cold December air comes flooding in like a mercy. This is the moment, this specific moment. The birth chamber at Versailles on the 19th of December, 1778. The moment when the most private thing a human body can do becomes the most public event in France. It will be in all the newspapers, in Paris and in London and in Vienna and in Madrid and in courts across Europe that have been waiting for this news for 8 years. It will be celebrated in the streets of Paris with bonfires and dancing, and the genuine joy of a city that still loves its king. It will be announced in churches and in coffee houses and in the markets where the ordinary people of France go about their ordinary lives. And in the birth chamber where the windows are finally open and the cold air is finally moving and the crowd is beginning to shuffle toward the doors in order of their precedence, in the birth chamber there is a woman in a bed and a child who will be taken away to a wet nurse, and a king who is crying quietly with his face turned away from the room so no one will see. This is the end of something, and the beginning of something, and also just a night in December, in a room in Versailles, in the middle of the 18th century. 3 things at once, as most moments in history are when you get close enough. You need to understand what came next. Not the grand historical next. We will get there. But the immediate physical next. What happened in the days after a royal birth? The recovery period for a queen who had just given birth publicly was itself a public event, though of a different kind. The churching, the formal ceremony of thanksgiving for the survival of mother and child, required a public appearance. The presentation of the child to the court required a formal occasion. The christening was a state event with guest lists and seating charts and diplomatic implications. But before all of that, there was the lying-in period, the weeks in which the Queen was officially not in public, officially recovering, officially confined to her apartments. And in that period, this compressed, protected, brief period, she was, more than almost any other time in her life as a queen, permitted to be a person, permitted to be tired, permitted to be slow, permitted to lie in bed and not perform. Marie Antoinette's lying in after the birth of Louis Joseph, her son, was interrupted by the arrival of the Emperor Joseph, her brother, who came to Versailles in part to meet his nephew and in part to lecture his sister about her political situation, her finances, her relationships at court, and various other topics on which he had strong opinions. He wrote to their mother afterward with a comprehensive critique of the French court, of Versailles, of the Queen's manner, of the King's management of affairs. It is one of the most detailed and perceptive documents we have of Versailles in the 1780s, and it was written by a man who was simultaneously the Queen's brother and an emperor visiting a foreign court and a critic with access. He saw everything. He wrote it all down. And then he left, and his sister went back to the performance of being Marie Antoinette, and the lying-in period ended, and the public life resumed. The private woman, who she was, what she thought, what she felt about the 8 years of waiting and the 4 births and the losses and the politics and the gathering storm, we can only glimpse in fragments. In a letter here, a diary entry there, in what the people around her chose to record. She was, by most accounts, a woman of considerable personal warmth, genuinely fond of her friends, devoted to her children, capable of real laughter and real grief. She was not the cold, calculating political schemer that her enemies accused her of being, nor was she the shallow, extravagant doll that her portraits sometimes suggest. She was a person in an impossible situation, performing an impossible role in a world that was about to become incomprehensible. She did not know that, none of them knew. This is the thing that history makes strange. The way we know what is coming, and they did not. The courtiers who crowded into the birth chamber in December 1778 did not know they were witnesses to one of the last births of its kind. The women who pushed to the front of the room, trading on their rank to get close to the royal bed, did not know they were participating in the final decade of a world that had existed for centuries. Louis, holding his wife's hand, genuinely happy for the first time in years, did not know that his happiness had an expiration date that was already approaching. They were just people, doing what people do, living in their world, which seemed permanent to them because all worlds seem permanent to the people living in them. The Habsburg version of the public birth deserves its own careful attention, because it differed from the French version in ways that reveal something important about the different cultures of monarchy in 18th century Europe. The Habsburg court was the oldest continuously functioning royal administration in Europe by the time Maria Theresa came to power in 1740. It had been doing this for 5 centuries, and 5 centuries of practice had produced a ceremonial system of almost geological density, layer upon layer of tradition, each layer representing a decision made at some specific historical moment and then preserved, because the Habsburg way was to preserve decisions rather than revisit them, to add to the accumulation rather than subtract from it. The Spanish influence was pervasive and deep. When Charles V had united the Habsburg and Spanish crowns in the 16th century, the Spanish court's traditions had merged with the Austrian, and the result was a ceremonial world of extraordinary formality. The Spanish court had developed a protocol so rigid that it had famously nearly killed a king. Philip IV of Spain was said to have sat unmoving in front of a fire that was too hot, growing redder and more uncomfortable by the minute, because the specific court officials whose job it was to move his chair were not present, and no one else could perform that function, and the king could not be seen to move his own chair. This story is probably apocryphal, but the fact that it was told, and told seriously, as an illustration of Spanish Habsburg protocol, tells you something about the culture that produced it. The Austrian Habsburgs had absorbed some of this, but had also retained their own separate traditions, the product of governing Central Europe rather than Castile, the product of dealing with Hungarians and Bohemians and Italians and Belgians, rather than the more homogeneous populations of the Iberian Peninsula. They were, in practice, somewhat more flexible than their Spanish cousins. Not flexible exactly. No Habsburg was flexible, but willing to negotiate with regional traditions to allow the Hungarian nobility their ancient privileges and the Bohemian estates their customs, because the price of insisting on uniformity was rebellion, and rebellion was inconvenient. This pragmatism extended to a degree to the birth chamber. The Austrian public birth was attended by witnesses, of course. This was non-negotiable. This was the foundation of everything. But the character of the witnessing was different, less theatrical than Versailles. more focused on specific witnesses with specific functions, less on the general principle that as many courtiers as possible should be present. The key witnesses at a Habsburg birth were the members of the Privy Council, the heir.Rat, who represented the kingdom's interest in the succession, and the senior members of the imperial household and the representatives of the church. These were the people whose presence guaranteed the birth, whose signatures went in the register, whose testimony could be produced in any subsequent legal or diplomatic proceeding. Beyond them, additional witnesses could attend, and typically did. The court was curious. The court wanted to be present. The court understood what being present meant in terms of one's place in the hierarchical world of Viennese court life. But they were not as absolutely required as they were at Versailles. There was slightly more room for the practical reality that births are unpredictable things that do not always wait for the full assembly of the court. Maria Theresa gave birth to her first child, Archduchess Maria Elizabeth, in February 1737. She was 19 years old. Her husband was Francis Stephen of Lorraine, the man who would eventually be elected Holy Roman Emperor, a warm and somewhat uncomplicated man who genuinely loved her, and was, she would later write, the only person at the Habsburg court she entirely trusted. He was in the room when the birth happened. He held her hand. The accounts of this first birth are more intimate than most royal birth accounts, partly because Maria Theresa and her biographers preserved more of the personal record, and partly because Maria Theresa herself was, from the beginning, someone who approached her own experience with the directness that was unusual in queens. She wrote afterward that it had been very painful and very frightening, and also, this is the part that is striking, very much worth it. She wrote about the child with the specific wonder of a new parent encountering a person for the first time, someone who had not existed yesterday and now existed completely. She wrote about Francis's face. She wrote these things in private correspondence, in letters not intended for public record, but she wrote them. And then she had 15 more children over the next 20 years, and kept governing an empire throughout, and by the time Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, she'd been through this experience so many times that its individual components had become, for her, almost ordinary. Almost, not quite. Because the thing about childbirth, even the 16th time, even when you're an empress who has administered the most complex monarchy in Europe and survived a war and built a bureaucracy and reformed the taxation system and done it all while pregnant or recovering from pregnancy, the thing about childbirth is that it remains, every single time, specific, immediate, particular. The pain is not abstract. The risk is not theoretical. The moment when the child arrives or doesn't arrive is always, in some sense, the first time. Maria Theresa understood this. She'd been through it too many times not to understand it, and yet she required it of her daughters, sent them out to foreign courts to do exactly what she had done, to inhabit the same machinery of public birth in their adopted countries, to be the vessels of those successions. She wrote to Marie Antoinette in the months before the Dauphin's birth about composure. She wrote from experience. And now let me tell you something that the official histories don't emphasize enough, which is that the tradition of the public birth required not just the Queen's endurance, but the court's performance of a very specific kind of witnessing. The witnesses were not supposed to react. They were not supposed to express emotion. They were supposed to be present, attentive, and appropriately blank, available to provide testimony afterward, if needed, without having tainted that testimony by displaying an investment in the outcome. This was, of course, impossible. People are not recording devices. People brought to a room where something dramatic and emotional and fundamentally human is happening will have responses that are fundamentally human. The accounts left by courtiers who attended royal births, the candid ones, the private letters, the diary entries, are full of reactions. Horror, sympathy, genuine fear for the Queen's life when labour went badly, relief that bordered on tears when the child was born alive. The public face was composed, the private face was human, and this gap between the composed public face and the human private one is, in miniature, the gap that defined the whole tradition. The court pretended to be witnesses in a legal sense, detached, objective, there to see facts rather than to experience events. But they were people in a room where an agonizing, dangerous, extraordinary thing was happening to another person, and they felt it. Of course they felt it. The Queen pretended to be enduring with composure, but she was in pain and afraid, and doing something her body might not survive, and she felt that too. Of course she felt that. The whole ceremony was finally a very elaborate performance of something that couldn't be performed, that human beings in extremity can maintain their roles while the extremity is happening. It worked, insofar as it worked. The babies were born, the records were kept, the witnesses signed, the succession was maintained. But underneath the performance, always, were the people, sweating in their heavy court clothes, holding each other's hands, breathing bad air, trying not to show how frightened they were. They were frightened. In the moments that mattered, under the silk and the protocol and the guilt, they were frightened because they were people, because people are frightened of the things that are frightening, no matter what they're wearing when the fear comes. Let's go somewhere else now. Let's go outside the palace for a moment. Let's go to the streets of Versailles on the morning after the birth. The town of Versailles, the actual town, not the palace, had grown up in the shadow of Louis XIV's decision to move the court there in 1682. Before the palace, there had been a village, a modest thing, a few houses and a church, and the small royal hunting lodge that Louis XIII had built. After the palace, there was a city that existed entirely because of the palace, that had no reason for being except proximity to the centre of French power, that fed and housed and serviced the enormous organism of the court. 30,000 people lived in the Palace of Versailles. Another 30 or 40,000 lived in the town. They were shopkeepers and servants and tradespeople and military personnel, and the families of all these people. They were the enormous supporting cast of the drama that took place in the gilded rooms above. On the morning of December the 20th, 1778, the bells of Versailles are ringing again. Not the internal palace bells, but the church bells, and they are ringing in celebration. In the streets, people are stopping and looking up at the sound, and someone is shouting the news from a window. Un dauphin, the word spreading mouth to mouth through the winter streets. A dauphin, an heir. In the pastry shops and the bakeries and the wine shops, people are raising glasses. Not everyone knows exactly what they are celebrating, not in any precise way. The dauphin is a political abstraction to a baker on the Rue de Paris. But the bells mean something good has happened, and something good happening in a palace is cause enough for celebration in a town whose entire existence depends on that palace. They do not know, they cannot see into those gilded rooms. They hear the bells, they celebrate, they go about their lives. This is what I want you to hold on to. The gap between the inside and the outside of that room. The gap between what the witnesses saw, the specific, intimate, physical truth of a birth, and what the world outside saw, which was an announcement, a ringing of bells, an abstraction called succession. The public birth was supposed to close that gap. That was its purpose, to make the thing that happened inside the room undeniable by making it witnessed. But the gap never fully closed, because no matter how many courtiers were in the room, the thing itself, the birth, the body, the woman in the bed, remained ultimately particular, specific, human, something that bells and court announcements and diplomatic dispatches could not quite capture. A child was born. A woman survived. 2 rooms away, the wet nurse was already nursing him, and the world went on. Let me talk to you about the specific protocols, the exact choreography of the room, because the public birth was not just attended, it was staged in the most literal sense, with blocking and positions and a sequence of events as carefully predetermined as a court ballet. And knowing the choreography tells you something important about what the tradition was actually for, beyond the obvious political justification. In France, the protocol for a royal birth had been codified and refined over generations, until it was a document of considerable specificity. It covered every contingency. Who entered first? Who stood where? The distance that had to be maintained between various ranks of courtiers and the royal bed. Who were permitted to approach after the birth? Who spoke first? Who received the child? Who carried the news to the antechambers, and from the antechambers to the corridors, and from the corridors to the city beyond? The premier gentilhomme de la chambre, the first gentleman of the bedchamber, held a position at royal births that was simultaneously ceremonial and essential. His job was the announcement. But not just the announcement, the sequence of announcements, the chain of communication that moved the news outward from the birth chamber in concentric circles, each circle receiving the information at the correct moment in the correct form from the correct person. He announced to the room first, "Le roi a un fils," or "Le roi a une fille." Then he dispatched messengers to the antechambers, then to the outer rooms, then to the gates of the palace, where additional messengers were waiting on horseback to ride to Paris. The news was calculated to arrive in the city within hours, in Versailles itself within minutes. The guns were fired, the Te Deum was sung in the chapel, the bells rang. Each of these responses was also choreographed, also predetermined, also part of the protocol document that had been prepared before the birth, and that existed in multiple copies in multiple offices of the palace administration. The birth was an event. An event requires logistics. Logistics require documentation. Documentation creates the official record that is, after all, the point of having witnesses in the first place. The official record of the birth of Louis-Joseph, Dauphin of France, in 1781 is a document of extraordinary density. It lists every witness. It gives the time, the clock time, certified by the royal clockmaker, who was present for exactly this purpose, and the day, and the month, and the year. It records the names of the physicians in attendance, and the name of the midwife, and the name of the priest who administered the sacrament. It records the physical characteristics of the child: weight, length, observable health. It records the exact words of the announcement. It is a document designed to be irrefutable, a document that, if ever challenged in a court of law, in a diplomatic negotiation, in a succession dispute, could be produced as evidence of the most unimpeachable kind. It was signed by 17 witnesses. 17. Each of those 17 signatures represented a person who'd been in the room, who had seen the birth with their own eyes, who was willing to attest under whatever oaths their culture considered most binding that what the document described was true. 17 people prepared to say, yes, I was there, yes, I saw it, yes, this child is real. Think about what it meant to be one of those 17. To be a person whose name is attached to this event permanently in the official record of the Kingdom of France, in a document that would be filed and copied and referenced for as long as France existed. To be, in some small way, a guarantor of the succession. Your name in the register, your presence in the room. This was the social contract of the public birth, seen from the witnesses' side. You were there, you signed, you were part of the machine, and in exchange for the discomfort of standing in an overheated room for hours in formal dress, you received something. You were indelibly part of the history. You were, in the official record, present at the creation. This was not nothing. At Versailles, where your entire social existence was defined by presence and proximity, where being invited to watch the king get dressed was a mark of status, where standing in the right room at the right moment could determine your career, your family's position, your children's marriages, being a named witness to a royal birth was significant. You were there. Your name is in the register. The king has a son. Let me tell you about one specific person who was present at several royal births, and whose account of them is unusually candid. She was not French. She was Austrian, one of the ladies who had accompanied Marie Antoinette from Vienna to Versailles in 1770, and who remained part of the Queen's household, never quite becoming part of the French court despite decades of proximity. Her letters home to Vienna describe, with the particular frankness of a person writing to family in a different country, what the births were actually like from the inside of the room. She describes the heat in terms that suggest genuine physical suffering, not complaint exactly, because complaint was not done, but description, the specific notation of a person whose capacity for observation was stronger than her capacity for politeness. She describes the smell. She describes it more plainly than most accounts do, in words that were clearly not intended for public circulation. She describes the specific combination of the birth itself and the crowd and the summer heat. Marie Antoinette's second daughter was born in July, and what that combination produced in terms of the air quality in the room. She describes the jostling, the way the French courtiers navigated the room with the specific aggression of people who understood exactly what was at stake in terms of position. She was Austrian. She was used to the Habsburg court, which had its own formality, its own elaborate protocols, but which was, in her estimation, written down in letters that were clearly therapeutic, somewhat less brutal about this particular business. She describes the announcement. She describes the silence that fell before the Premier Gentilhomme spoke. A silence, she says, felt like something physical, like a pressure in the room, and then the sound of his voice filling the space, and then the eruption of reaction, and then the scramble for the doors in the correct order. She describes going outside afterward, the cold air if it was winter, the relief, standing in a corridor and breathing and feeling the sweat on her back beginning to cool. She does not describe what she thought of the Queen. That would have been indiscreet. But she describes the room, and the room is enough. The Empress Maria Theresa, receiving these letters in Vienna, responded with the measured practicality that characterized her approach to everything. She acknowledged the conditions. She expressed satisfaction at the outcome. She noted that the public birth was essential to the legitimacy of the succession, that any discomfort experienced by the witnesses was secondary to the political function of their presence, and that she hoped her daughter had maintained appropriate composure throughout. She hoped the Queen had maintained appropriate composure. From a woman who had given birth 16 times in public and gone back to governing the empire, there is something almost moving about that, once you think about it long enough. Maria Theresa's advice to her daughter about composure was not the advice of a woman who didn't understand what she was asking. It was the advice of a woman who had done it herself many times and who believed, genuinely believed, I think, not just said, that composure under these conditions was possible and was worth maintaining. She was not wrong that it was possible. The queens did it. Generation after generation they did it. Whether it was worth it is a different question. Let me tell you about the doctors. Not just the physicians who attended the births, but the whole infrastructure of medical monitoring that surrounded a Queen of France throughout her pregnancy. From the moment a queen's pregnancy was confirmed, which required its own set of witnesses, its own formal announcement, its own entry in the court register, her body became the subject of constant official attention. The royal physician monitored her condition weekly, then daily as the pregnancy advanced. He submitted reports, not to the Queen, to the King's Council. The Council received these reports, which described the Queen's health, her symptoms, the physician's assessment of her condition and prospects, with the same dispassion with which they received reports on the state of the treasury or the progress of a military campaign. The Queen's body was not her own business. It was the kingdom's business, and the kingdom required regular updates. This was not considered intrusive. It was considered appropriate. The physician was doing his job, which was to ensure that the mechanism of the succession was functioning correctly, and keeping the King's Council informed was part of that job. The Queen was consulted about her symptoms. She was not consulted about the reports. She was not informed of what the reports said, or how they were received, or what conclusions the council drew from them. She was the subject of the reports, not their audience. The specific treatments prescribed during royal pregnancies reflected the medical understanding of the period, which is to say, they reflected ideas about the body that we now know to be sometimes helpful, frequently useless, and occasionally actively harmful. Rest was prescribed. Certain foods were recommended and others discouraged. Certain activities, riding, dancing, the more strenuous forms of court ceremony, were restricted as the pregnancy advanced. The Queen could not refuse these prescriptions. She could express preferences, could ask questions, could work with the physicians to find a regime that was tolerable, but she could not simply say no. The physicians were not treating her. They were managing the succession. Their authority derived from the kingdom's interest in her health, not from her consent to be treated. Consent is a modern concept. In 18th century France, the concept of a queen having the right to refuse medical treatment because she was a person with authority over her own body would have been almost incomprehensible. She was a queen. Her body was the kingdom's. The physicians were the kingdom's representatives. Their treatments were the kingdom's decisions. She endured. They all endured. And I keep using that word, endured, and I want to be precise about what I mean by it. I don't mean suffered, though they suffered certainly in the physical ways we've discussed. I don't mean merely survived, though survival was not guaranteed, and the women who made it through multiple births had done something genuinely impressive by the biological standards of their time. I mean endured in the sense that they did something that they had no choice about doing, and they did it over and over again, and they maintained themselves through it. They remained people. They had friends and interests and opinions and occasionally joys. They grieved when their children died. They loved the ones who survived. They had moments, quiet moments, small moments, the moments between the ceremonies when they were just themselves. Maria Leszczyńska, who gave birth 10 times in 24 years, who spent more of her adult life pregnant than not, who watched her husband's court with the patient endurance of a woman who had made her peace with things she couldn't change. She painted. She'd been trained in music and painting as a girl in Poland, and she kept both throughout her life at Versailles. She painted religious subjects mostly, saints, biblical scenes, the kind of subject matter that the court found appropriate for a queen who was known for her piety. But she painted, with her own hands, in the small hours of the day when the court's demands were briefly satisfied. She made things. She looked at the world and tried to translate what she saw into something she could touch and control and put in a frame. This is the private person underneath the public queen. This is what survived the birth chambers and the public scrutiny, and the long years of a marriage that was by any measure a disappointment. She painted, she endured, she was a person. And now, right now, at the end of this long night, in whatever room you're in, wherever you are also a person. Private, unwitnessed. You're breathing your own business, your sleep your own decision, your body's comfort and rest your own affair. The queens couldn't say that, not fully, not in the moments that mattered. You can. I want to talk about the mothers before we get to the end. I want to talk about the specific maternal experience that gets lost in all of this political history. Because when we talk about royal births as public events, we talk about succession and witnesses and the warming pan and the Protestant succession and the mechanisms of dynastic legitimacy. We rarely talk about what it was like to be the person in the bed. The medical reality of childbirth in the 17th and 18th centuries was, by modern standards, brutal. Maternal mortality was high. Infant mortality was higher. The tools available to physicians and midwives were limited. No antiseptics, no forceps until the late 17th century, and even then forceps were not always available, and not always used correctly. No caesarean section that could save a living mother, no understanding of germ theory, no blood transfusions, no epidurals, none of the interventions that have reduced childbirth mortality so dramatically in the past century. Women died, frequently, of blood loss, of infection, of exhaustion, of obstructed labour that went on too long without resolution. The death rate was not uniform across classes. Queens and noble women had access to the best physicians and midwives available, which was meaningfully better than nothing. And they also had access to adequate nutrition and care before the birth. But it was never zero. Every queen who entered a birth chamber knew this. They entered it knowing they might not leave it. That knowledge sat alongside everything else. The pain, the crowd, the protocol, as a companion that could not be acknowledged in public, but that was always, quietly, there. Maria Theresa lost 2 children very young, and several more in infancy or childhood, but she herself survived 16 births. This was not guaranteed. It was in fact statistically somewhat unusual. She was healthy and strong and had access to good care, but she also simply got lucky in the way that one must get lucky to survive 16 pregnancies in the 18th century. Marie Antoinette came close to not surviving her first birth. The suffocation, the grey she saw, the windows that had to be broken, the cold air that brought her back was a genuine threat. Had the king not reacted as quickly as he did, had the windows taken another few minutes to open, the outcome might have been different. The history of France and the history of the Revolution would have been different. These women knew the stakes. They always knew, and yet they had no choice. To decline the births, which was of course not actually possible. You cannot simply decide not to give birth, but to decline the public witnessing, to insist on privacy, to refuse the crowd. That was not an option. It was not thinkable. The Queen's body belonged to the succession. The succession required witnesses. The witnesses would be there. End of discussion. I keep returning to the same question as I think about these women. Not, why did they allow it, because that framing suggests they had a choice they didn't have. But something more like, what did they do with it? How did they incorporate this specific form of violation? Because I think that is the right word, violation, even in a world that did not have the vocabulary for it, into their understanding of themselves and their lives. And what I keep coming back to is that they mostly didn't talk about it. They didn't write about it extensively. They didn't frame it as an injustice in ways that were recorded. Whether that's because they genuinely accepted it, or because they had no language for refusing it, or because writing about it would have been understood as treason to their role, the result is the same. The birth chamber, with all its humiliation, all its exposure, remains mostly in the record as a political event, not a personal one. The exception is Victoria. Victoria, who wrote everything down, who had a pen in her hand practically from childhood, who produced diaries and letters at an extraordinary rate her entire life. Victoria had opinions about giving birth publicly, and she expressed them clearly. She found it degrading. She found it unnecessary. She understood perfectly well that by her time the warming pan had been exposed as a myth, and the practical argument for witnesses had dissolved, and she said so. She still had to do it, but she said so. By Victoria's time, the mid-19th century, the public birth had already been substantially modified. The Privy Council members were no longer in the room but in the corridor. There were fewer witnesses overall. The theatrical crowd of Versailles was a century in the past, understood even by people who maintained the tradition to be excessive. What remained was the principle: witnesses, documentation, formal attestation stripped of the most invasive elements. Victoria still found it degrading, and in that complaint, that clearly voiced written down objection, you can hear something that was always present in the birth chambers in 1688 and 1778, and the century before and the century after, but that was almost never spoken. I am a person. This is my body. This is private. This is mine. Victoria's complaints were noted, archived, and not acted upon for another century. But they were noted. They are in the record. They are the tiny crack in the official version, the version in which Queens of England gave birth in front of witnesses because the succession required it. Full stop. That lets you see the human being underneath the institution. Let me bring you back to Versailles one more time, not to 1778, to 1789, October 6th, 1789, the Women's March on Versailles. 6,000 women from Paris and the National Guard and Lafayette marching to the palace in the rain to demand bread in the presence of the royal family in Paris. The gates of Versailles were forced. Some of the palace was invaded. The Queen's bodyguards were killed at the door of her apartments. Marie Antoinette fled through a secret passage from her bedroom to the king's rooms, in her nightgown, barefoot, at 3 a.m. The secret passage connects the Queen's apartments to the king's. It is a private passage, a hidden one. It exists because even at Versailles, with all its performative openness, there were routes that were not public. There were doors that were not on the official maps. There were ways for the royal family to move through the palace without being watched. She used one of them, barefoot, in a nightgown, running from a mob. She had arrived at Versailles at 14. She'd given birth there 4 times publicly in front of the court. She had learned every corridor, every antechamber, every ceremonial door and its weight and its sound. She knew this palace better than almost anywhere she had ever been, and she left it through a hidden passage, running for her life on a rainy October morning. The court at Versailles never returned. The palace was locked up and later, during the Republic, used for various administrative purposes. The birth chamber was kept more or less intact. The gilt rails around the royal bed, the raised platform, the enormous room that had once held hundreds of witnesses, empty. Later it became a museum. The rooms were restored. The furniture was returned, or replaced, or reconstructed. The birth chamber is there still if you visit. The bed, the platform, the mirrors, the silk panels. A room that was designed for a specific, strange, particular kind of event that no longer happens anywhere. Visitors walk through it. They look at the bed. They read the plaques. They try to imagine what it was like. I have been trying to help you imagine it tonight. Not from the outside. Not from the perspective of a visitor or a historian. From the inside. From the bed. From the specific, animal, terrifying, exhausting, undignified witnessed reality of being a woman in that room on that night. You are tired now. That is appropriate. You have earned tiredness. You have been in a room for hours. Your body has done something enormous. The crowd is leaving, finally the courtiers filing out in their correct order, their faces composed, their presence in the record. The cold air is coming through the window, and it is the finest thing you have ever breathed. The candles are burning low. The fire has died back to coals, red-orange in the grate, giving off a warmth that is no longer oppressive but steady and quiet. The room that was full of 150 people is now nearly empty. Just the midwife checking on you with her quick, practical hands. The physician making notes in the corner. The king still at your side, his face slack with relief. Outside the windows, Versailles is beginning to think about morning. The sky is not yet light, but it has changed from the absolute black of 3 a.m. to something that might, if you were looking hard, have the faintest suggestion of grey at the horizon. The December dawn comes late. You close your eyes. The child, your son, the Dauphin of France, the future Louis XVII, who will have a brief, terrible life in a prison and die at 10 years old, though you do not know that. No one knows that. He is right now new and unnamed and furious at the cold, is 2 rooms away, sleeping against the wet nurse who has been waiting for this moment since your pregnancy began. He is warm. He is fed. He is witnessed and documented, and his existence is already being dispatched to courts across Europe. He is real. This is the thing they all came for. The 150 people in the room, the bells in the churches, the celebration in the streets, this proof, this tiny, squalling, undeniable proof that the succession continues and the dynasty is real, and the Queen did her job, and the witnesses saw it happen. He is real. You are real. Your body is your own again, or will be, slowly over the weeks ahead. Your blood, your breath, your hands on the rails of the bed, yours. The room is emptying. The crowd is gone. The night is almost over. In all the centuries of this ritual, in all the rooms, in all the palaces across all of Europe where queens gave birth publicly, and the court watched and the records were kept and the succession was secured, in all of those rooms the same thing was true that is true tonight. The witnesses came and went. The court came and went. The politics came and went, the dynasties rose and fell, the specific arrangements of power that seemed so permanent dissolved in the heat of revolution or the slow cooling of time. But the body remained, the child remained. The utterly ordinary, utterly extraordinary fact of a person coming into the world, that remained. That always remained. The candles gutter. One goes out, then another. The room grows a little darker and a little quieter. Outside, Versailles is still. The night watchmen walk their rounds. The gardens are silver with frost. The fountains are stilled for winter. Far away through the thick palace walls you can hear, or imagine you can hear, the sound of the infant. The thin, fierce, absolute cry of new life, demanding to be known. It's that recent, that real. Close your eyes. Let the room be what it is. A room, now. Just a room. The ceremony done and the witnesses gone and the enormous theatre of the birth concluded. The gilt and the silk and the mirrors at their quiet vigil. The fire in its grate. The cold air through the window carrying the smell of frost and old stone, and the particular winter smell of a palace that has been standing for a century and will stand for centuries more. You have survived this. That is not a small thing. The women who lay in rooms like this, across the centuries, across the palaces, they survived mostly. They endured the public watching and the private fear and the enormous physical demand of birth, and they survived. They had children and raised them and lost them and watched them grow. They had lives inside the institutions that contained them. They were underneath the protocol and the ceremony and the role. People. Maria Theresa with her 16 children and her empire. Maria Leszczyńska with her 10 births and her quiet faith. Charlotte with her 15 children and her practical calm. Victoria with her complaints written down and her refusal to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Marie Antoinette with her windows broken open and the cold air rushing in. All of them. All of those rooms, all of those nights, they are over now. The tradition ended quietly in 1948. A government minister declining to stand outside a hospital room in case someone suggested a warming pan. The long shadow of 1688, finally lifted by the prosaic light of common sense. But the births happened. The rooms were full. The witnesses stood and witnessed, and the records were kept, and the children were born. And here we are, centuries later, in the dark. The bells of Versailles are far away. They are always ringing in the past. You're somewhere warm, somewhere quiet. Not a palace, not a room full of courtiers. Somewhere private, which is something they did not always have. Your body is heavy with the comfortable weight of rest. Let the night settle around you. Let the images fade, the crowd, the candles, the cold air through the broken window. Let it all soften into something less immediate, less loud, less present. The stories are told. The births have happened, all of them, decades and centuries ago in rooms that are museums now. The women rested afterward. Eventually they always rested. You can rest now too. Let the room go quiet. Let the fire in the grate burn down to coals, red-orange and warm and steady. Let the candles gutter out one by one, leaving just the dark and the warmth and the sound of your own breathing. Tomorrow the world will do what it does, make demands, require performances, expect the endless output of presence and function and role. Tomorrow the bells will ring again, and the doors will open and the court will assemble. But that is tomorrow. Right now, there is only this. The particular peace that comes after an enormous thing has been endured. The specific quiet of a room that was full and is now empty. the warmth, the dark. Close your eyes. The child is safe. You are safe. The cold air through the window is just cold air, and the sounds of the palace settling are just the sounds of old stone and old wood, the ordinary noises of an old place at night. Let your hands loosen on whatever you've been holding. Let your shoulders drop. Let the thoughts slow down, the way thoughts slow down when the body finally decides it's done for the night, the way the conscious mind begins to release its grip on the day and let the day go. Let it become the past where it belongs. Let it recede into the long corridor of things that happened. Things happened. They always do. Generations of women in rooms just like this, with the witnesses and the bells and the politics and the child at the end of it, crying and real and witnessed. They were witnessed, and now it is done, and you can sleep. Let sleep come the way winter air comes through an opened window, cold and clean and immediately completely filling the space. Let it take your thoughts first, their half-formed ones at the edge, the ones you are still holding. Let them go. You are warm enough, quiet enough, safe enough. The night is doing what nights do. The palace at Versailles stands empty now, rooms preserved, placards in 4 languages, tourists in comfortable shoes trying to imagine. They look at the bed on the platform, they read about the witnesses, they take photographs. They cannot quite imagine what it was. You came closer tonight. Now let it be the past where it belongs. Let the centuries roll back. Let the gilded rooms go dark. Let the candles go out one by one in all these rooms where queens were witnessed and daughters were born and sons were named and the succession was maintained or failed or struggled forward into a future that always, always surprised the people who thought they were securing it. Let all of it go dark. Let there be just this, the sound of your own breathing, the warmth, the dark. Some things don't change. The need for rest, the weight of a long day lifting, the moments when the body finally says enough and the mind agrees, and the two of them together go somewhere quiet and deep, where bells don't ring and doors don't open, and no one is watching. There is one more person in this story who has not been properly introduced yet. One person whose role was as essential as the Queen's, as essential as the King's, as essential as the premier gentilhomme who made the announcement, more essential, in practical terms, than all of them combined. The midwife. In 1778 at Versailles, the royal midwife was a woman named Margaret Le Boursier de Coudray, though by the time of Marie Antoinette's birth the position had passed to others in her tradition. The office of royal midwife was one of the most coveted medical positions in France. Not the most prestigious, that belonged to the first physician, who was always a man, who supervised everything, who signed the official documents, who received the credit in the formal record. But in practice, in the room, at the bedside, when something needed to be done immediately and correctly or the Queen would die, in that moment, the midwife was what mattered. The tradition of female midwives in France was ancient and fiercely defended. Male physicians had been encroaching on midwifery throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, partly through the introduction of forceps, invented by the Chamberlain family in England in the early 17th century and kept secret for decades, because the Chamberlains understood that a tool nobody else had was worth more than a tool everyone shared, and partly through the general tendency of the period to professionalise and masculinise any field that had previously been considered women's work and therefore beneath official notice. But the French court had specific and practical reasons for preferring female midwives for royal births. The reasons were political, as so many reasons at Versailles were political. but they were also grounded in a century of experience. Women had delivered royal children for generations. They knew the work. They had the hands for it, literally, the hands, the specific tactile knowledge that comes from years of attending births, feeling the position of the child, assessing the progress of labour in ways that no book had yet described adequately. And there was another reason, which was rarely stated plainly because plainness was not a Versailles virtue, but which everyone understood. A female midwife in the birth chamber of a queen was less politically threatening than a male physician. A woman at the bedside doing the actual work was invisible in the way that women doing work were generally invisible at the French court. The male physicians could supervise, could advise, could take credit afterward in the official records. But the woman with her hands on the Queen's body, she was doing what women did, which was to say she was doing something that didn't require acknowledgement. This invisibility was, in its way, a kind of protection. The midwife could work without the layers of protocol that surrounded the male physicians. She could speak directly to the Queen without navigating the elaborate hierarchy of who addressed whom first and in what terms. She could say push when she meant push and breathe when she meant breathe, without framing it as advice or couching it in the formal language of a royal consultation. She was there for the body, not the politics. And in the birth chamber, the body was what mattered. Ducoudray herself, who retired before the births of Marie Antoinette's children, had spent decades travelling across France training midwives in rural communities that had no access to skilled obstetric care. She made a teaching model, a fabric and leather mannequin, anatomically detailed, on which she could demonstrate the mechanics of difficult deliveries, and she took this model from town to town, village to village, training local women in the techniques that could save mothers and children who would otherwise die for want of skilled attendants. She trained 4,000 midwives over the course of her career, 4,000 women spread across France, each of them carrying a piece of her knowledge into rural communities where the alternative was a neighbour with good intentions and no idea what to do when a baby was turned the wrong way. Ducoudray never became famous in the way that male physicians of the period became famous. She appears in histories of medicine as a notable figure remembered, but she is not household name famous. The men who wrote the official records of royal births, the first physician, the court historians, the men who kept the registers, they wrote themselves into the story. They wrote themselves prominently. The midwife got a mention. This is how it worked. This is how it always worked. The birth chamber at Versailles was a room full of people with competing claims on its history. The courtiers who were present would tell the story afterward with themselves at the centre. They had been there. They had witnessed. They had been close enough to see the Queen's face. The physicians would document it in terms that foregrounded their expertise and their interventions. The political officials would record what they needed to record for the succession to be legal and binding. And somewhere in all of this, the midwife's hands kept doing what they did. Steady, practiced, entirely focused on the specific task of making sure the person in the bed survived it. She did not write it down. Not as extensively as the others, not in ways that have survived as completely, but she was there. And what she knew, the specific physical bodily knowledge of what it meant to be in that room, she took with her when she left. Let me talk about what it was like to be a courtier at a royal birth. Not the Queen, not the midwife. One of the people pressed against the gilt railings at the back, straining to see, standing in formal dress for hours in an overheated room. Because the public birth was a performance with an audience, and audiences have their own experience, their own perspective, their own very complicated relationship to what they are watching. The Duc de Croy left one of the more candid accounts of attending a royal birth at Versailles. He was present for the birth of Marie Antoinette's first child in 1778, and his memoir describes the event with a mixture of ceremony and something approaching dark comedy that feels very honest about the experience of standing in a crowded room for hours waiting for a baby. He describes the scramble for position, the way the room filled and filled until there was no air and no space. He describes men climbing on furniture, which he seems to have found embarrassing, both the act and the fact that he understood their motivation. He describes the heat. He describes the particular quality of silence that fell over the crowd when the birth itself was happening, the held breath of 150 people all becoming, in that moment, witnesses in the most literal sense. And he describes, with an honesty that is somewhat surprising in a man of his class and period, his relief when it was over. Not just the birth, but the event. The hours of standing, the heat, the strange intimacy forced upon everyone in the room. He was relieved to be outside in the cold, breathing real air. The public birth was not, for the witnesses, a comfortable experience. They were there because they had to be, because the protocols of the court required it, because to be absent would have been to surrender one's place in the hierarchy of presence that defined life at Versailles. But had to be there, and enjoyed being there, are different things, and the accounts left by people who attended these births suggest that the enjoyment was limited. There was, yes, the sense of participation in a historical event. There was, yes, the cachet of having been present, the ability to say for the rest of one's life that one was in the room when the Dauphin was born. That cachet was real, and it was valuable, and it motivated the early arrival and the aggressive position-taking, and the willingness to stand in an overheated room for hours. But it was not pleasant. It was duty, performed, with all the complexity of things that are simultaneously important and uncomfortable, and impossible to opt out of, which, now that I think about it, describes quite a bit of what it meant to be a person of any significance in Versailles. Let me go further back. Let me go before Versailles, before the Sun King, before the elaborate ceremonial machinery that Louis XIV constructed. Let me go to the births that established the template. The tradition of public royal births in France did not begin with Louis XIV. It predates him by centuries, running back through the medieval monarchy to a time when the relationship between a king's body and the bodies of his subjects was understood in terms that seem very foreign now, but were in their time entirely coherent. Medieval kingship was, in one sense, a physical condition. The king's body was sacred, literally consecrated at the coronation with holy oil, in a ceremony that was understood to transform the person of the king into something more than human, something semi-divine, a person in whose veins ran the blood of sovereignty. This was not a metaphor, it was meant literally, at least in the sense that medieval people meant literal things, which involved a much more fluid relationship between the symbolic and the actual than we tend to maintain. If the king's body was sacred, the birth of the royal heir was a sacred event. It was a moment of divine significance, the continuation of God's anointed line on earth, and as a sacred event it required sacred witnesses. Not just the secular court, but the church. Not just the living, but, in a sense, the saints whose relics were brought to the birth chamber to ease the labour and protect the mother and the child. The relics of St. Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth, were among the most requested items for royal and noble birth chambers in medieval France. St. Margaret had been, according to her legend, swallowed by a dragon, and then burst out of the dragon's stomach, which made her the obvious choice for a patron of women whose bodies were also doing something extreme and requiring divine protection. The Queen in labour would hold a fragment of St. Margaret's relics, or a cloth that had touched them, or a sealed box said to contain them. The priest would pray, the midwives would work, the court would witness. This was the birth chamber in the 13th century, in the 14th, in the 15th, when it was gradually becoming something more recognisably like the Versailles version, more formally organised, more systematically witnessed, with more explicit attention to the political function of the event. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian princess who married into the French royal family in 1533, and who would become one of the most powerful and controversial figures in French history, Catherine went through the public birth ritual multiple times. She was married to Henri II, the son of Francis I, and she gave birth 10 children over the course of a marriage that was complicated in ways that are almost too many to enumerate here. Henri's favourite was Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than him who remained his mistress essentially throughout their marriage, who wielded significant influence at court, and who Catherine had to tolerate because the structure of the court gave her no alternative. Catherine endured, as queens endured, and she gave birth in public 10 times, and several of her children died young, and 3 of them became kings of France, Francis II, Charles IX, Henri III, and 1 became Queen of Navarre, and the history of France was significantly shaped by the children born in those public chambers. She was from Florence. Florence was not France. The ceremonial life of the Medici court was elaborate in its own way, but it was not Versailles. It couldn't be. Versailles didn't exist yet. And Catherine had to learn the French way of doing things, the French protocol of the birth chamber, as one of the many adaptations required of a woman who had moved at 14 to a foreign country to marry a king who would love someone else. She adapted. She always adapted. Catherine de' Medici's later reputation, the Black Queen, the Poisoner, the woman behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, is a complicated product of Protestant polemic and genuine political ruthlessness. But whatever she was certainly adaptable. She learned the birth chamber, she learned the court, she learned to be queen in a country that was not hers, in a way that outlasted her husband and outlasted most of her enemies. Her births were witnessed 10 times. Let's talk about something that official accounts never quite address directly, which is the question of what happened when things went wrong. Because things went wrong. Not every time, not even most of the time, but often enough in the centuries of this practice that the possibility was always present, always understood, always the shadow underneath the ceremony. A difficult birth in a public room was its own specific kind of nightmare, when a baby was poorly positioned, when the labour stalled, when the hours stretched past the point where everything should have been resolved, and the physicians were looking at each other with the expressions that physicians use when they are considering options they don't want to say out loud. In those moments, the audience of the public birth became something different. They became a problem, because a room full of courtiers and ambassadors and foreign diplomats, when the Queen's labour is going badly, creates exactly the kind of political information vacuum that fills itself with rumour and speculation and anxiety. The court could see that something was wrong. They could see the physicians conferring. They could see the midwife's face. They could not be told to leave. The protocol didn't allow for that. The witnesses were supposed to be there. Sending them away would itself create suspicion. But their presence made everything harder. because the people trying to manage a medical emergency were simultaneously performing that emergency in front of an audience. There were births that ended in tragedy, children born dead, or who died within hours, children who were born alive and announced and celebrated and then quietly disappeared from official accounts within days. The infant mortality rate among royal children was savage, despite, or perhaps in some cases because of, the attentions of court physicians who, well-meaning and learned by the standards of their time, nonetheless practiced medicine in ways we would now recognize as actively harmful, bloodletting, purging, the specific 18th century belief that fresh air was dangerous to newborns and sick people, which meant that the rooms in which royal babies were kept deliberately stuffy, which contributed to the spread of infection in exactly the way you would expect if you sealed sick people into unventilated rooms. The Dauphin Louis-Joseph, Marie Antoinette's son, was the beneficiary of this care. Born in 1781, he was small and delicate from the beginning, and the curvature of his spine that would eventually kill him was visible early. The court physicians attended to him with everything in their arsenal: the purges, the bleeding, the consultations, the second opinions, the third opinions, the treatments brought from specialists in Paris and in Versailles, and from Vienna. Because Maria Theresa had strong opinions about medicine, and sent those opinions to her daughter, along with her usual political advice. He died in June 1789, 3 years old, 2 months before the storming of the Bastille. His parents had already lost one daughter, and the revolution was about to take everything else. But in the summer of 1789, what they knew was that the small boy who had been born publicly, who had been celebrated by the entire French court, who had been the centre of such enormous political hope, was gone. Marie Antoinette, who was not by training or inclination a person who showed her emotions publicly, she had been performing composure since she was 14, wept. She wept in front of people. She was reported to have said that nature had given her a child, and the courtiers had taken him from her, which sounds like a strange thing to say until you understand what she meant. What she meant was the court physicians, the court remedies, the elaborate machinery of royal medicine that had attended her son from birth and had not saved him. Nature had given her a child, they had taken him. It was not an accusation she ever made officially. It was something she said to someone who wrote it down, and it survived. A crack in the performance, a glimpse of the actual person underneath. Let me tell you about the wet nurse. The wet nurse was a specific figure in royal births, as important in her way as the midwife, and as invisible in the official record. She was the woman who fed the royal children, because queens of France, queens of most royal houses in Europe, did not nurse their own babies. This was not considered unusual. Wet nursing was common among aristocratic women, who considered breastfeeding incompatible with their social obligations and their physical recovery. And there was also a popular medical belief of the period that breastfeeding while experiencing strong emotions could damage the milk and harm the child, which meant that anyone in a situation of political stress, which, at Versailles, was everyone always, had a convenient medical justification for not nursing. The royal wet nurse was selected carefully. She had to have recently given birth herself, to have adequate milk, to be healthy, to be of appropriate character. The character requirement is interesting. The belief that the character of the nurse could be transmitted through her milk to the child was taken seriously in the 18th century, which meant that the woman who nursed the Dauphin was scrutinized for signs of moral deficiency with the same rigor applied to her physical health. Her own child, the child she'd just given birth to, the child whose birth had produced the milk that qualified her for this position. Her own child was typically given to another wet nurse, or raised by the husband or family, or sometimes simply died. The records don't always say. The records don't always bother. She came into the birth chamber immediately after the royal child was born. She was waiting, had been waiting for weeks or months, installed in the palace when the Queen's labour became imminent, fed and housed and kept healthy for exactly this moment. She took the child, she carried him away, and she fed him, and she kept him warm, and she was with him in ways that his mother was not. For the weeks and months of the early life that are so formative. Marie Antoinette had a complicated relationship with this tradition. She wanted to nurse her own children. She said so. Her mother wrote from Vienna that this was appropriate maternal feeling, but possibly not practical. And would she please think about the political implications? Because if the Queen was nursing, she could not attend certain functions, and certain functions required her attendance. She did not nurse her own children. She spent as much time with them as the protocol allowed, which was more time than many queens had allowed themselves. She genuinely liked her children, enjoyed their company, was one of those people for whom the presence of small children is a pleasure rather than an obligation. The accounts of her time with her daughter Marie-Thérèse and her son Louis-Charles suggest warmth, playfulness, the genuine attention of a person rather than the formal duty of a queen. But the wet nurse fed them, and the nurses raised them, and the protocol determined when and how the queen could be with her children. And the structure of Versailles, which had been designed for so many things, had not been designed for the kind of private family life that Marie Antoinette apparently wanted and could not have. This is the other cost of the public birth that is rarely calculated. Not just the birth itself, the room full of people, the witnessed labour, the political necessity of it all, but everything that came after. The wet nurse who took the child, the nurseries managed by court officials, the elaborate ceremonial of even the simplest parental contact, the way in which having a child in the public world of royalty meant that the child was never quite yours, never quite private, never quite outside the machine. The Dauphin's first public appearance was at a few weeks old, when he was presented to the court in a formal ceremony. He was held by the premier gentilhomme, displayed to the assembled courtiers who filed past to pay their respects. He screamed through most of it, which everyone found charming. He was too young to know that this was the shape of his life, always witnessed, always on display, always the subject of other people's calculations. He was never going to be an ordinary person. He never had the chance. Let me take you out of Versailles for a while. Let me take you to England in a different century, to a birth that was not public in the Versailles sense, but that had consequences that shaped everything that came after. The year is 1566. The place is Edinburgh Castle. The Queen is Mary, Queen of Scots, and she is in labour with her first child. Mary's situation was, even by the standards of 16th century royalty, complicated. She was Queen of Scotland in her own right. She was also the Catholic heir to the English throne, which made her of enormous interest to the Protestant Queen Elizabeth of England, who had spent the years since Mary's return to Scotland in 1561 watching her cousin with a calculating attention that was part kinship and part geopolitical threat assessment. She was married to Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, a vain and ineffectual man whose principal qualification for the marriage had been his royal blood, and the marriage had gone badly almost immediately, souring into mutual contempt within months. In March 1566, while Mary was pregnant, her husband Darnley and a group of Protestant nobles burst into her private chamber at Holyrood House and murdered her Italian secretary David Rizzio in front of her. They dragged him screaming from her presence, or so the most dramatic accounts have it, stabbing him 56 times in the anteroom. Mary was 6 months pregnant at the time. She survived. The pregnancy survived. And 3 months later, in Edinburgh Castle, she gave birth to the child who would become James VI of Scotland and eventually James I of England. The birth was attended as Scottish custom required. The witnesses were there. The child was born, healthy and alive, and was presented to the assembled court and christened with great ceremony. But there was a problem. Or rather, there was a question, the oldest question, the one that followed royal births like a shadow. Darnley, who was already falling out of favour and would be murdered in circumstances still disputed in February 1567, raised doubts. He raised them quietly, in the way that cowards raise doubts, not directly to Mary, not in any form that could be officially addressed, but as whispers, as suggestions, as the kind of question that didn't need to be stated plainly to do its damage. Was the child his? The whispers circulated. They reached Elizabeth of England, who had reason to hope and reason to doubt, and who maintained her usual position of strategic ambiguity. They reached European courts that were watching Scotland's political situation with varying degrees of interest and alarm. Mary responded with the only response available to her. She presented the child. She said in front of the assembled court that the child was Darnley's, that she was pleased to have a son, that she hoped God would give the child a long life. Darnley, standing there, could not contradict her. He had no evidence. He had suspicion and spite, which are not the same thing. The child grew up to be James VI of Scotland and James I of England, the king who authorised the King James Bible, who commissioned Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, who united the Scottish and English crowns, who presided over the beginning of British colonial enterprise. He was a peculiar, complicated, intellectually brilliant man, and he was the great-great-grandfather of James II, whose warming pan would give the public birth its most enduring justification. History circles in strange ways. The question of James's paternity, which was probably not a question at all, probably Darnley was his father, probably the whispers were just politics in the form they usually took at 16th century courts, never fully went away during his lifetime. It was part of the background noise of his reign. It was the reason he was obsessed, throughout his life, with questions of legitimate authority and divine right, with the theological and philosophical justification for kingship that went beyond the mere accident of birth. Because for James, born of a murdered father's likely child and a queen who was executed when he was 19 years old, the accident of birth had never felt entirely secure. The public birth, the room full of witnesses, the irrefutable evidence, was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of doubt. And yet the doubt persisted, even when the birth had been witnessed, because witnesses can lie, and witnesses can be wrong, and witnesses can be manipulated. And in the end, the only thing that absolutely proves a child's legitimacy is a kind of certainty that no amount of witnesses can provide. This is the fundamental impossibility at the heart of the tradition. The public birth was designed to eliminate doubt. But doubt is not a question of evidence. It is a question of faith, of politics, of what people want to believe. And no amount of courtiers in a room can change what people want to believe. The warming pan proved it. The warming pan was believed by people who had access to testimony, to witnesses, to the basic facts. They didn't want the testimony, they wanted the warming pan. Because sometimes the story that serves your interest is more compelling than the truth. This is not a problem that ended in 1688. This is not a problem that ended at all. But it is a problem that the tradition of the public birth attempted, in its cumbersome and often terrible way, to address. And now let me bring you back to Versailles one final time, not to 1778, not to the birth of Louis Joseph. Let me bring you to a quieter moment, a morning several weeks after the birth, when the court is still celebrating and the Queen is still recovering and the political aftermath of the Dauphin's arrival is still being calculated in every chancellery in Europe. It is a morning in January 1779. The Queen's apartments, a private room, not the birth chamber, not the formal receiving room, but one of the smaller, more intimate spaces that existed even at Versailles. Because even at Versailles there were degrees of public and private, gradations of access, rooms that were less crowded, moments that were less performed. The fire is going. Outside, snow is falling on the gardens of Versailles, covering the formal beds and the precise paths, softening the geometry of the landscape into something rounder, quieter, less demanding. Marie Antoinette is sitting by the window. She's been given dispensation to rest. The lying-in period requires it, the physicians insist upon it, and she's watching the snow. A lady-in-waiting sits as a corner embroidering. She's close enough to be available, but far enough not to intrude. This is the skill of ladies-in-waiting. Proximity without presence, availability without imposition. The Queen watches the snow. What is she thinking? We don't know. We can't know. The snow-watching Queen is a private person in a private moment, and private moments at Versailles left few traces, but she is 23 years old. She has a son, the Dauphin, who's in the nursery 2 floors up, being cared for by nurses and physicians and the elaborate apparatus of royal infant care. She's permitted to visit him twice a day. She does so every day, with a regularity that the court has noted and some of the court has found touching, and some of the court has found excessive, because excessive maternal feeling was considered somewhat undignified in a queen who had other functions. She's not thinking, in this moment, about politics. She's not thinking about the succession or the witnesses or the future. She is watching the snow. This moment, this specific, private, unrecorded moment, is the one that the public birth was designed to prevent. Not this moment exactly, but the privacy that this moment represents. The tradition of the public birth was part of a larger system that had, as its fundamental premise, the idea that a queen's private life was a threat, that anything that happened behind closed doors, without witnesses, without the court's knowledge, was potentially dangerous, potentially fraudulent, potentially subversive, potentially catastrophic. And so the court watched and watched, and the Queen had no door she could close against it, because the doors of Versailles were designed to be open. The lever, the couvert, the promenade, all of it designed to make the royal family's life permanently, inescapably public. The birth chamber was just the most extreme version of what every other chamber was. Marie Antoinette watching the snow in January is a small rebellion, a minor act of being a person. The snow falls, the fire crackles, the lady-in-waiting's needle moves through the silk, the Queen watches, and then the bells ring. Some appointment, some duty, some requirement of the day. The moment ends. She stands, straightens, becomes the Queen again. the performance reassembling around her like a shell. The window is cold where she was sitting. The view of the snowy garden is the same. She goes. There is something I want you to sit with as we begin to come toward the end of this night. Not a historical fact or a political analysis or a story about a specific queen and a specific room. Something more like an observation. The thing about the public birth, the room full of courtiers, the witnesses, the entire elaborate machinery of witness succession, is that it was finally a massive and expensive and often cruel attempt to make certainty out of something that is inherently uncertain. The truth of a child's parentage, the reality of a birth, the proof of legitimacy that could be used as the foundation of dynasties and alliances and international settlements and the redistribution of vast amounts of power and wealth and human lives, and the attempt always, in some way, failed. Because certainty of that kind, absolute, unassailable, beyond all possible doubt, is not something that can be manufactured by putting 150 courtiers in a room. The warming pan was believed despite witnesses. The old pretender was doubted despite his obvious reality. Mary Queen of Scots' son was whispered about despite everything. The doubt always found a way. What the public birth actually accomplished, what all that suffering, all those rooms full of overheated courtiers, all those queens giving birth in front of audiences, what it actually accomplished was something different from certainty. It accomplished shared experience. It created a community of witnesses who had been in the room together, who'd seen the same thing, who shared a memory. Even if the memory could be doubted, the sharing of it could not. Even if the birth could be disputed, the fact of having been present could not. This is not the same as certainty. But it is not nothing. There is something almost democratic about it in a deeply undemocratic world. The birth chamber was one of the few places in Versailles where rank, while it determined your position in the room, did not determine whether you were present or not. The princes of the blood stood at the front, the servants at the back, the foreign ambassadors and the court officials and the ladies in waiting, and the physicians and the midwife. All of them in the same room, all of them breathing the same air, all of them witnesses to the same event. Afterward they all had the story. The Duc de Croy and the footman who handed him his coat on the way out, the first physician who signed the register, and the washerwoman who cleaned the sheets. They had all been there, or been nearby, or heard the bells. In a world of absolute hierarchy, the birth made everyone, briefly, the same kind of witness. That's not justification for what was done to the women in the bed. Nothing justifies that. The queens were not consulted about whether they wished to give birth publicly. The tradition predated them. It would outlast them. They had no choice, and no amount of interesting analysis about the community of witness changes the fact that they were denied privacy at the most vulnerable moment of their physical lives. But it is something to hold alongside the horror that the room full of people was also, in its way, a room full of people. Not abstractions, not political functions, not instruments of succession. People who are cold and tired and standing in uncomfortable clothes for hours, waiting for a new life to begin. The new life began. It always began, or almost always. And in those moments when it did not, when the bells rang with news that was not celebration but grief, when the court withdrew in the specific silence of a death, even then they were all there together, witnesses to the price that this tradition extracted from the women at its centre. The price was enormous. It was paid, again and again, for centuries, and then it ended. Quietly, as I said, in 1948, when a government official signed a paper that said ministers of the Crown were no longer required to attend royal births, and the long shadow of the warming pan lifted at last, and the birth chamber became finally what it had always deserved to be, a private room, the last official witness to a British royal birth. The Home Secretary who attended the birth of Princess Margaret in 1930 apparently sat in a corridor for 4 hours, reading documents, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, technically fulfilling a requirement that everyone involved understood to be meaningless. He drank 3 cups of tea. He went home. And in the room down the hall, the Queen gave birth in something approaching the privacy that had been denied to queens for 700 years. It is not nothing, that moment in 1930. It is not glamorous, and it is not the kind of historical turning point that gets dramatic reenactments and Hollywood adaptations and sweeping orchestral scores. A man in a corridor drinking tea while someone else's baby is born somewhere he cannot see. But it is the end of something, and the ending of something that should never have existed in the first place is always worth marking. Now you are here, in the dark, wherever you are, not in a palace, not in a room full of witnesses, not performing, not being watched, not required to give birth to the succession in front of the assembled court of France. Just here, just this. The room you are in is your own. The dark is your own. The privacy of this moment. The fact that you can close your eyes and no one is watching. No one is craning their neck to see over someone else's shoulder. No one is keeping a register of your presence and your position in the room. This is not something to take lightly. It is not a thing that was always available. It is not a thing that was available to the women I've been describing tonight. Not at the moments that mattered. Not in the rooms where everything was witnessed. They endured the rooms. They survived the witnesses. They gave birth and recovered and raised children and ran courts and corresponded with empresses and watched snow fall on formal gardens in January. They were people. Under the protocol, under the silk and the gold and the elaborate performance of royalty. They were people who wanted privacy and rarely had it and found their small moments of it when they could. The snow, the fire, the lady-in-waiting in the corner, the specific animal relief of cold air through a window. That's enough for a night. That's enough to take into sleep. Let the rooms of Versailles grow dark. Let the candles go out one by one, as they always did, as servants moved through the halls with their snuffers, ending the light. Let the fires burn down to coals. Let the gilt railings stand empty, the birthbed unoccupied, the platform silent. Let the snow fall on the gardens. Let the bells rest. Let sleep reach up and take you gently by the shoulders, the way exhaustion takes you when you've been awake long enough. Not suddenly, not with a jolt, but gradually, insistently, the way tides come in. You don't have to stop thinking. The thinking stops itself. The thoughts thin out and separate, and the spaces between them grow wider and quieter, and eventually the spaces are all there is. Just quiet, just dark, just the sound of your own breathing, steady and slow, in a room that is yours, in a night that asks nothing of you. You are warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. More than the queens in their public rooms, surrounded by their witnesses, required to perform the private act of birth in front of the assembled court of France. You're more private than they were, more left alone, more allowed to be just a body, just a person, just a creature that needs sleep, and takes it without ceremony. That's an extraordinary thing, actually. That's worth a moment of acknowledgement. Before sleep takes it, and then let sleep take it. Let the weight of the day dissolve. Let the history recede into the comfortable past where it lives. Let the queens rest in their places in the record, witnessed and documented and endured. Let the snow fall on the gardens of Versailles, covering everything, softening everything, making the world quiet and white and still. Let the night be what it is. Let there be nothing required of you. Sleep. The bells are not ringing. The doors are not opening. No one is coming. Sleep, and dream of winter gardens and the smell of cold air through a window that is finally open, and the particular piece of a room that is empty and warm and entirely your own. Good night.